Hello and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. On a spring morning in the year 1453, in the cold gray light before dawn, a young man stood on the deck of a ship that was not a ship, or not only a ship, because what Mehmed II had ordered dragged overland on greased logs across the neck of the Golden Horn was something closer to an idea made of timber and iron and the sweat of thousands, and the idea was simply this: that no wall, no chain, no 1,000 years of Roman stone could keep a man from what he had decided was already his. The ships had been built in a matter of weeks in the shipyards of the Bosphorus, and now they were being hauled, fully rigged, sails set to catch the morning wind, over hills and through orchards, across 70 cubits of dry land, to be lowered into the waters of the harbor behind the great chain that protected Constantinople. The defenders on the walls, watching that morning, saw the impossible made timber, and they knew then, in the marrow, what the world would spend the next 4 centuries learning: that the Ottomans had arrived, and that they did not think the way other empires thought. Whether every detail of that story happened exactly as the chroniclers wrote it, nobody now can say, because stories of the conquerors are polished like sword hilts by the hands that hold them, and the truth underneath grows thin with handling. But what is beyond all question is what the dragging of those ships announced. The Ottoman Empire, which had begun 2 centuries earlier as a small band of frontier warriors on the edge of a crumbling Byzantine world, had grown into something that the old powers of Europe and Asia did not yet have a name for: a state that combined the holy war of the frontier, the administration of the great settled empires, the tolerance of the Roman tradition it was about to extinguish, and a peculiar, persistent, almost eerie ability to see obstacles as things to be gone around rather than gone through, whether the obstacle was a harbor chain, a mountain range, or 1,000 years of Christian kingship. That combination, elastic and relentless, would carry the House of Osman from a tent in the hills of western Anatolia to the gates of Vienna and the shores of the Indian Ocean, and sustain it through sieges and succession crises and the slow poison of its own later habits for 600 years, longer than Rome, longer than any continuous dynasty in the history of the world. And here is the strange thing, the thing that makes this story worth telling in the quiet hours of the night, the thing that this whole long tale will spend itself trying to understand. The Ottoman Empire did not rise the way other empires rose, by overwhelming force at the beginning, by some vast inheritance or lucky windfall. It rose slowly, patiently over centuries, by a method that looked to its enemies like something between genius and sorcery. And then, having risen, it did not fall the way other empires fell, in a single catastrophe, a single war, a single night of ruin. It fell by inches, by degrees, by the quiet accumulation of habits that had once been strengths and had become so gradually that hardly anyone could say when the change occurred, the opposite of strengths. The institutions that built the empire became, one by one, the institutions that paralyzed it. The flexibility that had allowed 70 ships to walk overland became rigidity. The tolerance that had drawn talent from every corner of 3 continents became a kind of brittle defensiveness, and the capacity for self-correction, the honest, unsentimental ability to look at a failure and learn from it, which had been the secret engine of Ottoman success for 200 years, slowly, quietly, century by century, shut down, like rooms in an old palace being closed for the winter, until, at the end, the empire stood frozen in its own past, unable to change, unable to adapt, unable even to see clearly what it had become, while the world it had once terrified and led moved past it and left it behind. Before we drift into the rest of this story, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the night. And there is something pleasant about knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same dark sky, listening to the same slow story. So get comfortable, let your shoulders sink into the bed, and let yourself ease into the tale of the Ottoman Empire, the longest-lasting single dynasty in recorded history, the empire that terrified Europe for centuries, and then, almost imperceptibly, became the sick man that Europe gathered around its bedside to divide. A story not of a single terrible night, but of a long, slow, gorgeous afternoon that stretched across 600 years and faded, so gradually that the men who lived through the fading did not know they were living through anything but an ordinary season, until the light was gone and the house was cold, and the last sultan, a quiet, scholarly man who had never wanted to rule, packed his books and his dignity and walked out of the palace into exile, leaving behind nothing but a name, a dream, and a question that still hangs over the Bosphorus on certain evenings. How did it last so long, and how did it end so quietly, and what exactly happened in between? We cannot begin with the ships over the hill, though that is where every school book begins, because the ships over the hill were not a beginning but a result, the mature expression of a system that had been building for 2 centuries on the frontiers of Anatolia. We have to begin further back, in the grasslands of Central Asia, with a people who were not yet a people, with a story that the Ottomans themselves would later tell to explain who they were and why the world had been given to them. And like all founding stories, it contains truth and invention braided so tightly that no historian's fingers can unweave them, and the braid itself is the thing that matters. A people come out of the steppe. In the deep past, so deep that the Ottomans themselves could only gesture at it in their chronicles, the Turkish peoples had lived as the steppe peoples had always lived, moving with their herds across the vast grasslands of Inner Asia, fighting from horseback with a composite bow, following leaders whose authority rested on charisma and success and could be lost in a single failed raid, organizing themselves not by territory, but by kinship, clan, and tribe. They were not a single nation. They were dozens of peoples speaking related languages, pushing westward over centuries in waves that are still not fully understood, driven by drought, by pressure from other nomad peoples behind them, by the simple gravitational pull of the settled lands with their cities and their grain and their gold. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Turkish peoples had reached the lands of Islam, and something happened that would shape the next 1,000 years of world history. They converted. Not all at once, not uniformly, tribe by tribe and chief by chief over generations. The Turks of the frontier zones entered the faith of the Prophet, and they entered it with the particular fervor of converts, the zeal of the newly arrived. And they entered it at exactly the moment when the old Islamic empires, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, were decaying, fragmenting, losing their grip on their frontiers, and needed, urgently, a new source of military energy. That military energy the Turks supplied in abundance. Across the 10th and 11th centuries, Turkish slave soldiers, Mamluks, and free Turkish war bands became the sword arm of half the courts of the Islamic world. And then, in the 11th century, came the great explosion, the Seljuk Turks, a dynasty that had united much of the Turkish East under its rule, burst into the lands of the Byzantine Empire in Anatolia, and at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, they shattered a Byzantine army and captured its emperor. And in the aftermath, the Anatolian plateau, which had been Greek and Christian for a millennium and a half, began to become Turkish and Muslim. Not overnight, not in a single conquest, but over generations, as nomads moved their flocks onto the high grasslands, as the old Byzantine administration crumbled, as the population of the plateau shifted its language and its faith and its allegiance. By the year 1300, Anatolia, the land that would become the heart of the Ottoman Empire, was a patchwork of small Turkish principalities, the Beyliks, each ruled by a local dynasty, each competing with its neighbors for land and prestige and the grazing rights that were the economy of the frontier. And on the westernmost edge of this Turkish world, pressed up against what remained of the Byzantine Empire in Asia, There ruled a minor bey named Osman, the son of Ertugrul, a man so obscure that we possess not one single contemporary document bearing his name, so dim that some historians have doubted he existed at all. And yet the empire that would carry his name across 6 centuries and 3 continents claims him as its founder, and the story of how a minor frontier lord became the memory of a dynasty is the first of the 1,000 mysteries this empire asks us to contemplate. The dream of Osman. The chronicles the Ottomans themselves would write, centuries later, looking back at their own origins through the golden haze of achieved magnificence. Tell a story that is too beautiful to be entirely true and too important to be entirely ignored, because the story a dynasty tells about its own beginning is never just a story. It is a mirror in which the dynasty sees its own nature, and the Ottoman mirror showed this. Osman, the chronicles say, was staying one night in the house of a holy man, a sheikh named Edebali, and in the night he dreamed. He saw a great tree spring from his own body, a tree that grew and grew until its branches covered the whole world, its shade falling over the Caucasus and the Danube and the Atlas Mountains and the Nile, over all the lands that the Ottomans would one day rule. And at the foot of the tree there rose 4 great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the Nile and the Danube, watering the world beneath the leaves. And the tree's leaves were swords, and they turned in the wind toward Constantinople, which lay at the center of the dream like a jewel waiting to be set. Osman woke and told the sheikh his dream, and the sheikh interpreted it. God had given him and his descendants dominion over the world, and the sheikh's own daughter would be Osman's wife, knitting the spiritual authority of Islam to the political authority of the House of Osman in a marriage that would never, in the Ottoman imagination, be unknitted. The dream is almost certainly a later invention, a story told by a great empire to explain its own greatness, but it contains, in compressed and symbolic form, truths that the bare facts would take much longer to tell. The Ottomans were, from their earliest days, a frontier state, a March principality on the border between Islam and Christendom, and the frontier gave them their character. The frontier was where the old rules broke down, where Orthodox Islam met the folk religion of the nomads, where the settled bureaucracies of the old empires gave way to the personal authority of the war leader, where Greeks could become Turks, and Turks could become something new. A frontier society in which loyalty and success mattered more than ancestry and orthodoxy. The early Ottomans were not, in any sense that a modern eye would recognize, Turkish nationalists. They were a warband, an enterprise, a venture, and anyone who could ride and fight and contribute to the enterprise could join it, and many did. Greeks and Slavs and Albanians and the younger sons of Anatolian Turkish families, all of them drawn to this small, aggressive, successful state on the western edge of the Turkish world that kept winning battles and expanding its territory and attracting more men who wanted to be on the winning side. The dream of the tree, read honestly, is the dream of a frontier state that has begun to imagine itself as a world empire. And the remarkable thing is not that the dream was dreamed, but that it came true. The first sultans built the machine that would carry the dream forward, and they built it piece by piece, without a master plan, responding to problems as they arose, stealing good ideas from their enemies, and inventing new institutions when the old ones failed, in the unsystematic, pragmatic, utterly effective way that successful empires have always been built. Orhan, Osman's son, captured the city of Bursa in 1326 and made it his capital, and Bursa gave the Ottomans something the frontier had not provided: a settled city with a revenue base, a trading economy, a place where the plunder of the frontier could be converted into the permanent infrastructure of a state. Orhan built mosques and schools and bridges, and he minted coins, which is the thing that serious rulers of that age did to announce that they were no longer tribal chiefs but sovereigns of a permanent state. And he organized the army, creating the first regular infantry units of the Ottoman military, and he crossed the Dardanelles into Europe in the 1350s, gaining the first Ottoman foothold on the continent that would become the center of the empire, the bridgehead across which, in the following decades, the Ottomans would pour into the Balkans in a flood that would not be turned back for 300 years. But it is under Murad I, Orhan's son, that the institution which more than any other shaped the Ottoman Empire for its first 3 centuries came into its full form. And it is an institution so strange, so coldly rational, and so morally disorienting to the modern mind, that we must pause and look at it directly, because without it, the Ottoman rise is unintelligible. The devshirme, the gathering, was a levy of Christian children from the empire's Balkan territories, a tax paid in boys. Every few years, Ottoman officials would travel through the Christian villages of the Balkans and select the strongest and most promising boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 15, and take them from their families, and the families would weep and sometimes try to hide their sons or maim them to disqualify them. And the Ottoman records themselves, in their dry bureaucratic language, record the weeping as a standard part of the transaction. The boys were taken to Istanbul, converted to Islam, given a rigorous education in the palace schools, trained in languages, in the Islamic sciences, in administration and the arts of war, and then, according to their demonstrated abilities, they were assigned to the 2 great career paths of the Ottoman ruling class. The best of them entered the palace service and rose, over decades, through the ranks of the imperial administration, eventually becoming viziers and provincial governors and the men who ran the empire on the sultan's behalf. The others entered the Janissary Corps, the slave infantry of the sultan, the first standing army of its kind in Europe, a force of professional soldiers who knew no loyalty but to the sultan, who were forbidden to marry or own property or engage in trade, whose entire life was the barracks and the campaign, and who became, for 2 centuries, the terror of the Christian powers of Europe. The boys who were taken from their Balkan villages rose to command armies and govern provinces and accumulate vast fortunes, and they never saw their families again. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of this for a moment, in the dark, because the devshirme is one of those Ottoman institutions that makes the empire so difficult for the modern mind to grasp. It was, by any humane standard, a cruelty, the systematic removal of children from their parents, the deliberate severing of the most fundamental human bond. And it was also, by the standards of the age and by the results it produced, a stroke of organizational genius, a mechanism for creating a ruling class that was entirely dependent on the sultan, that had no local loyalties or hereditary claims to compete with its loyalty to the throne, that could be trained from childhood for the specific tasks it would perform, and that drew, generation after generation, the brightest and strongest of the empire's subject peoples into the service of the state that had conquered them. The grand viziers who governed the empire at its height, the admirals who commanded its fleets, the generals who led its armies, the architects who built its mosques, were overwhelmingly the sons of Balkan Christian peasants, taken as children, converted, educated, and promoted on the basis of merit rather than birth, in a system that was, in its cold, bureaucratic way, more meritocratic than any European kingdom of the age. The Ottoman ruling class was an artificial family, created by the state, loyal to the state, and reproduced by the state. And its members competed with one another not on the basis of who their fathers were, but on the basis of their abilities, their education, and their networks of patronage within the system. The empire was governed, in other words, by a meritocracy of former Christian children, and they governed it, by and large, extremely well, better than any hereditary aristocracy governed any European kingdom of the period, with more efficiency, more attention to law and order, more tolerance of diversity, and more consistent military success. The moral calculus of this arrangement is not one we can settle tonight, and perhaps it cannot be settled at all, only observed with the unease that honest observation often brings, a machine that ran on the stolen childhoods of Balkan Christians, and that produced, out of that theft, the most tolerant, efficient, and long-lasting empire in the history of the Islamic world. With the devshirme in place, and the Janissaries at the center of the army, the Ottoman war machine accelerated. Murad I crushed the Serbian kingdom at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a battle that still echoes in the national memory of the Balkan peoples to this day, a battle in which Murad himself was killed, stabbed, the chronicles say, by a Serbian nobleman who had feigned death on the field. and approached the Sultan's tent as a supplicant, so that the first great Ottoman victory in Europe was also, fittingly, a reminder that even sultans die, and that the death of a sultan is the moment of maximum danger for any dynasty. Murad's son, Bayezid, was proclaimed sultan on the battlefield while his father's body was still warm, and his first act as sultan was to have his own brother strangled, to prevent the succession dispute that every Ottoman prince had the right to wage, and that every Ottoman sultan had the duty to prevent. That strangling, too, is part of the institution we must understand before we proceed, because the Ottoman approach to succession was one of the most brutal and effective political arrangements ever devised by any monarchy, and it shaped the empire's history as profoundly as the devshirme or the Janissaries. The Ottomans did not practice primogeniture, the inheritance of the throne by the eldest son. Any son of the sultan had an equal claim, and the succession was determined by competition, by a civil war among the princes that ended when one of them had eliminated his brothers and established himself as the undisputed ruler. The chronicles record, without particular horror, the number of Ottoman princes strangled with silk bowstrings on the accession of a new sultan, because it was not, in the Ottoman understanding, murder. It was the necessary cost of political stability, the sacrifice of the few to prevent the civil wars that would kill the many. The sultans who ordered the executions of their brothers were not, in their own self-understanding, cruel men. They were prudent administrators of the dynastic peace, and the peace held, which is more than can be said of most dynasties, and the empire survived its succession crises, generation after generation, while the kingdoms of Europe tore themselves apart in wars of rival claimants. There is a coldness at the heart of this empire, a willingness to do what other states considered unthinkable, that we will meet again at every turning of this story, and it is part of what made the Ottomans so terrifying to their enemies. They operated by a logic that was not the logic of Christendom, and they did not apologize for it, and they won. Bayezid, the son who had his brother strangled on the battlefield of Kosovo, was called Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, and he burned across the Ottoman sky with a speed and violence that seemed, for a brief decade, to promise the conquest of everything. He campaigned from the Danube to the Euphrates, crushing a crusader army at Nicopolis in 1396 in an afternoon that sobered Europe for a generation, and he pushed the Ottoman frontier deeper into the Balkans and deeper into Anatolia, and he built an empire that stretched from the Black Sea to the Aegean. And then, at the height of his power, he met a conqueror who made his thunder look like summer lightning. Timur the Lame, Tamerlane, the Lord of the Steppe, the last and greatest of the Central Asian conquerors, descended on Anatolia with an army that outnumbered Bayezid's and crushed it at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, capturing the Sultan himself and carrying him off in a litter. The thunderbolt caged. The empire that had seemed invincible shattered in a single afternoon, its territory splintering among Bayezid's surviving sons, who immediately began the civil war that Bayezid's own ruthlessness had been designed to prevent. The Ottoman state, which had taken a century to build, was destroyed in a day, and the chroniclers of Europe, who had been composing elegies for Constantinople, allowed themselves to hope that the Turkish nightmare was over. It was not over. The Ottoman recovery from the disaster of Ankara is, in its way, as remarkable as anything in the empire's history, because it revealed, for the first time, the resilience that would become the Ottoman signature. The civil war among Bayezid's sons lasted a decade, and it ended when Mehmed I, the youngest of them, the one the chronicles describe as patient and gentle and deliberate, had outlasted and outmaneuvered his brothers and reassembled his father's shattered empire, piece by piece, province by province, year by year. He ruled for only 8 years after that, dying in 1421, but he had done the essential thing. He had proven that the Ottoman state could survive a catastrophe that would have finished most dynasties, that the institutions Orhan and Murad had built, the administration and the army and the system of recruitment and loyalty, were stronger than the man at the top, stronger than any single defeat, stronger than the hammer of Timur himself. The Ottoman recovery was not glamorous. It involved no single decisive battle, no brilliant stroke of genius. It was slow, patient administrative work, the reassertion of central control over provinces that had learned to govern themselves during the interregnum, the rebuilding of the army, the careful negotiation with the Christian powers of the Balkans who had taken advantage of Ottoman weakness to recover territory. It was, in other words, the kind of work that empires do when they are serious, the unglamorous, patient, year-by-year work of reconstruction. And it tells us more about why the Ottomans lasted 600 years than any of their famous victories. Mehmed I's son, Murad II, continued the rebuilding, and he fought the wars that his father's reconstruction made possible, campaigning in the Balkans and Anatolia, pushing back the frontiers that had contracted after Ankara. And he also did something that his predecessors had not done. He tried to retire. Twice, Murad abdicated the throne in favor of his young son, the prince who would become Mehmed II, and twice he was called back by crisis, by the revolt of the Janissaries or the invasion of a Christian army, because the empire could not yet manage its own succession without the presence of the father. The young Mehmed, a boy of 12 when he first sat on the throne, had already, by the time he became sultan for the third and final time in 1451, learned the lesson that his father's failed retirements had taught, that the throne was not a chair, but a contest, that the men around it were not servants but rivals, and that a sultan who showed weakness would be eaten by his own system. He was 19 years old when he became sultan for the third time, and he had been studying power since he could read, and he had a single idea in his mind, an idea that had been the Ottoman dream since Osman had dreamed of the tree, an idea that his father had never quite dared to pursue, an idea that every Ottoman sultan before him had contemplated and set aside as premature or impossible. Mehmed was going to take Constantinople, the city that waited. To understand what Constantinople meant to the Ottomans and to the world of the 15th century, we have to pause and look at it through the eyes of the men who wanted it, because the city was not simply a city. It was the city, the queen of cities, the new Rome, the capital of an empire that had been the Christian Empire, the Roman Empire, for 1,000 years after the old Rome in Italy had fallen to the barbarians. Its walls, built by the Emperor Theodosius in the 5th century, were the most formidable fortifications in the world, a triple line of stone and brick that had turned back every siege for 1,000 years, that had broken the armies of the Avars and the Persians and the Arabs and the Bulgars and the Rus, that had made Constantinople the one great Christian city of the East that the Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries had never been able to reach. Behind those walls, the city preserved the accumulated treasures of classical civilization, the manuscripts of Greek philosophy and Roman law that the scholars of the West were already beginning to rediscover, the mosaics and the relics and the ceremonies that made the Byzantine Empire, even in its shrunken and impoverished old age, the legitimate successor of Rome. And the city sat, geographically, like a knife at the throat of the Ottoman state, because the Ottoman territories in Europe and the Ottoman territories in Asia were divided by the narrow straits of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, and Constantinople commanded those straits, and as long as Constantinople was in Christian hands, the Ottoman Empire was two halves that could be separated in any serious war. Every Ottoman sultan understood this. Every Ottoman sultan had accepted the strategic necessity of taking the city, and every Ottoman sultan before Mehmed had concluded that the walls were too strong, the investment too costly, the risk of a failed siege too great. Mehmed understood the arithmetic and made a different calculation. The young sultan was not an easy man to love, and the sources that describe him, Greek and Italian and Ottoman alike, draw a portrait that is unsettling even at 5 centuries distance. He was brilliant, learned, fluent in multiple languages, a reader of Greek philosophy and a patron of Italian painters, a man who could discuss the theology of the Trinity with Christian clerics and the engineering of cannon with Hungarian foundrymen, a Renaissance prince in everything but his faith and his throne. He was also, by any standard, ruthless, capable of ordering executions with a calm that his own courtiers found chilling, capable of the casual cruelties of the age and of cruelties that exceeded the age. A man who had watched his own half-brother, an infant, murdered in his bath on his first accession to the throne, to eliminate the possibility of a rival, and who had accepted this as a normal cost of power. He trusted no one completely, and his solitude at the center of his court was absolute. The solitude of a man who understands that power has no friends, only interests, and that his own interests required him to be harder, smarter, and more unpredictable than anyone around him. He was, in other words, exactly the man the moment required, because Constantinople had resisted 1,000 years of sieges, and it would take a sultan who combined intellectual brilliance with moral ruthlessness, strategic patience with tactical audacity, and a willingness to ignore every piece of conventional military wisdom, to finally break it. The siege began in April of 1453, and it is one of the most heavily documented events of the Middle Ages, because everyone involved understood, even as it happened, that they were living through a hinge of history. The accounts survive from both sides of the walls, Greek and Italian and Ottoman, and they give us the siege in extraordinary granular detail. The weather, the morale, the arguments in the war councils, the small human moments that make the abstraction of history into something you can feel in your stomach. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI, the last of the Roman emperors, was a man of courage and dignity who had inherited a hollow shell of an empire, a city of perhaps 50,000 people rattling around inside walls meant for 500,000, its treasury empty, its army a few thousand Greek and Italian soldiers, its harbor blocked by the Great Chain across the Golden Horn, but its sea walls weak and undermanned. He knew, and everyone in the city knew, that no relief was coming from Christian Europe. The powers of the West had been promising a crusade to save Constantinople for a century, and the promises had produced nothing but fine phrases and empty embassies, because the kings of Europe had their own wars and their own troubles, and could never quite believe that Constantinople would actually fall, until it was falling. The last Christian emperor of the East stood with his back to the sea and his face to the Turkish guns, and he made the decision that the chroniclers record with awe: to stay and fight when flight was still possible, to die on his walls as his city died around him, because he could not imagine living as an ex-emperor in a world where the city was gone. Mehmed, for his part, threw everything he had against those walls, and what he had was extraordinary. He had an army of perhaps 80,000 men, a fleet of more than 100 ships, and a corps of siege engineers that included the Hungarian gun founder named Urban, who had first offered his services to Constantine and had been turned away because the emperor could not pay him, and who had then gone to Mehmed and been paid handsomely and asked a single question: could he cast a cannon that would break the walls of Constantinople? Urban said he could, and he did, and the great bombard he cast for Mehmed, a monster of bronze 27 feet long that threw a stone ball weighing more than half a ton, became the terror of the siege, firing day after day at the land walls, its sound carrying for miles, its stone balls smashing into the brick and mortar that had defied every army for 1,000 years. The cannon was too large to move frequently, and it took hours to reload, and it cracked and had to be repaired and eventually destroyed itself from its own recoil. But it did its work. The walls, which had been built before gunpowder was invented, could not withstand the new mathematics of siege warfare, and day by day, breach by breach, the 1,000-year fortifications began to crumble. But the cannons alone did not take the city, and neither did the numbers, because the defenders, Greek and Italian, fought with a desperation that the besiegers' own chronicles record with respect, repairing the breaches at night, repelling assault after assault on the collapsing walls, keeping the harbor closed behind the Great Chain, holding out through April and into May, while the Sultan's frustration mounted and his counselors began to murmur that the siege should be abandoned before a Christian relief army arrived. And it was at this moment, under this pressure, that Mehmed did the thing that the school books remember, the thing that we began this story with, the thing that no one had thought to do because no one had thought it possible. He had his ships dragged overland on greased logs, across the hills behind the Genoese colony of Galata, around the Great Chain, and into the waters of the Golden Horn, inside the harbor, behind the sea walls where the city's defenses were weakest. In a single night, The Byzantine position was transformed from difficult to impossible. The defenders, already stretched thin along the land walls, now had to defend the sea walls as well, walls that had never been designed to withstand a serious assault because the harbor had always protected them. The harbor no longer protected them because the harbor was full of Turkish ships, and the city's doom, which had been approaching for 7 weeks, arrived at last. The final assault came on the night of the 28th of May, and it is worth pausing to note the date because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays had been considered unlucky in Constantinople since the city's founding, and the people in the churches that night knew it and prayed anyway. The emperor, having done everything that a man could do, attended a last service in the great church of Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, built by the Emperor Justinian 900 years before, the largest and most magnificent church in Christendom, and then he rode out to the walls to wait for the dawn and the assault. The assault came in waves, the irregulars first, expendable, wearing down the defenders. Then the Anatolian infantry, disciplined and steady, and then, in the last hours before dawn, the Janissaries, the professional slave soldiers of the Sultan, the finest infantry in Europe, fresh and armored and advancing in silence, without the war cries that had accompanied the earlier waves, a wall of men moving through the darkness toward the broken walls. Somewhere in that darkness, a small postern gate, the Kirko Porta, had been left open, whether by accident or treachery no one ever established, and the Janissaries found it and poured through and raised their standard on the walls, and the defense, which had held for 53 days, broke at last. The emperor, seeing the end, threw off his imperial regalia so that his body would not be identified and dishonored, and charged into the melee, and was never seen alive again, and with him died the Roman Empire, which had been old when the Ottomans were a band of nomads in the hills of Anatolia, and which ended, after 2,000 years, on a Tuesday morning in May, in the breach of a wall, in the gray light before the sun came up. Mehmed entered the city later that day, and he rode to Hagia Sophia, and he dismounted at its doors, and he scooped up a handful of dust and poured it over his turban as a sign of humility before the God who had given him the victory. And then he entered the great church and ordered it converted to a mosque, and the muezzin climbed to the dome and called the faithful to prayer, and the conquest of Constantinople, which had been the dream of Islam for 800 years, was accomplished. But Mehmed did not destroy the city. He began, almost at once, to rebuild it. He repopulated it, moving families from Anatolia and the Balkans into its empty houses. He repaired its walls and built new markets and baths and mosques. He granted the surviving Christian communities the right to maintain their own churches and their own patriarch under Ottoman protection, in a system of religious autonomy that would become the Ottoman model for governing diversity. And he claimed, explicitly and deliberately, the title of Kaiser-i-Rum, the Caesar of Rome, the successor of the Byzantine emperors, the legitimate heir of the Roman imperial tradition in the East. The Ottoman Empire, on the day the city fell, became something more than a Turkish sultanate. It became a claim to universal sovereignty, a claim that the Sultan was the rightful lord of the world, and the claim, whether the kings of Europe accepted it or not, would structure Ottoman foreign policy for the next 4 centuries. The conqueror in his city. Mehmed II, now called Fatih the Conqueror, the name by which history remembers him, ruled for another 28 years, and in those years he built the skeleton of the empire that his successors would flesh out. He codified the laws, issuing the first great Ottoman legal codes, the Kanun name, which would govern the empire's administration for centuries, and which established the principle that the Sultan's law, based on the needs of the state, existed alongside the Sharia, the sacred law of Islam, in a dual legal system that gave the Ottoman state a flexibility that many Islamic states of the age lacked. He reorganized the devshirme and the palace school, creating the formal curriculum that would train the empire's ruling class, and he built the Topkapi Palace on the promontory overlooking the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus. the palace that would be the center of Ottoman government for the next 400 years. A sprawling, low-slung complex of courtyards and pavilions and gardens that was not a fortress but a stage, a theater of power in which the Sultan's authority was performed through ceremony and silence, and the elaborate gradations of distance and access that separated the ruler from the ruled. He conquered the last fragments of the Byzantine world, the Greek kingdom of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast and the despotate of the Morea in southern Greece. And he fought the Venetians for control of the Aegean Islands and the Adriatic coast. And he landed an army in Italy that captured the city of Otranto in 1480, raising the Ottoman banner on Italian soil for the first time, and sending a shock of terror through the courts of Europe. And if he had not died the following year, at the age of 49, with his army preparing for a new campaign, no one can say where the Ottoman frontier would have stopped. He died, it should be said, as he had lived, in the midst of a campaign, and the cause of his death is uncertain, poison suspected but never proven, and his body was brought back to Istanbul, to the city whose name had gradually shifted from Constantinople to the Turkish name by which it is known today, and he was buried in the mosque complex he had built on the hill overlooking the Golden Horn, the first of the great imperial mosques that would crown the city's 7 hills. And the empire he left was not yet the mature empire of Suleyman the Magnificent, but it was no longer the frontier principality of Osman's time. It was a state that spanned 2 continents, that commanded the straits between Europe and Asia, that had absorbed the ancient institutions of the Byzantine Empire and made them its own, that was governed by a trained bureaucracy drawn from its subject peoples, that fielded the most modern army in Europe, and that claimed, with some justice, to be the legitimate heir of Rome. The first act of the story was complete, and the curtain falls on Mehmed the Conqueror, the brilliant, ruthless, solitary man who had achieved the impossible and founded the empire's greatness, and who had also, without meaning to, set the pattern that would harden into an iron cage for his successors, the pattern of the Sultan as the unique, isolated, terrifying center of all power, a pattern that would work magnificently under strong sultans and fail catastrophically under weak ones, and that would, in the end, become one of the quiet engines of the empire's decline. But before any of that, before the decline and the long afternoon and the sick man of Europe, there was still a century to come, the greatest century in Ottoman history, the century in which the empire would reach its maximum extent and its maximum glory and its maximum danger. And the century would be shaped, more than any other single figure, by a man who was 10 years old when Mehmed died, a boy living in the provincial city of Trabzon on the Black Sea coast, the son of the provincial governor, a boy named Selim, whose own son would one day be called Suleyman the Magnificent, and whose life, brief and violent and terrible, would set the stage for everything that followed. The terrible Sultan. Selim I is not the Ottoman Sultan the world remembers. That honor belongs to his son, Suleyman, whose reign would be the golden age of the empire, the age of Sinan and Barbarossa, and the armies at the gates of Vienna, the age that the Ottomans themselves would look back on for centuries as the high noon from which everything afterward was a decline. But Suleyman's greatness was built on Selim's ruthlessness, and the story of how the empire reached its height cannot be told without the story of the man who removed every obstacle from his son's path, including his own brothers and his own father and, in the end, a substantial portion of the Islamic world. Selim came to the throne in 1512 by forcing his father, Bayezid II, to abdicate, and Bayezid died a month later, probably poisoned, and Selim then had his brothers and his nephews, all of them, executed, eliminating every possible rival in the traditional Ottoman manner, and he earned, from this thoroughness, the epithet by which history knows him: Yavuz, the grim, the stern, the terrible. He ruled for only 8 years, and in those 8 years he fought 3 great campaigns, and he won all 3, and he tripled the size of the empire, and he did it with a speed and violence that shocked even his own court. The first campaign was against the Safavid Empire of Persia, the rising Shia power that had emerged in the east under the young, charismatic, messianic Shah Ismail, who claimed descent from the Prophet and whose Turkmen followers, the Kizilbash, fought with a religious fervor that made them, for a generation, the most frightening military force in the Islamic world. Selim, a devout Sunni, saw the Shia of Persia not merely as a political rival, but as a heresy that had to be extinguished. And in 1514, he marched his army east across Anatolia, into the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey, and met Ismail's army at the plain of Chaldiran. The battle was one of the decisive encounters of the 16th century, and it turned on a fact that Ismail had not absorbed, and Selim had. Gunpowder had changed the rules of war, and the old cavalry charges of the steppe could not break infantry armed with cannon and muskets. The Ottoman Janissaries, dug in behind a line of wagons chained together, with their firearms and their discipline, shredded the Safavid cavalry, and Ismail fled the field, and the aura of his invincibility was broken forever. Selim occupied the Safavid capital of Tabriz but could not hold it, his army unwilling to winter so far east, and he withdrew. But he had accomplished the essential thing. The Safavid threat was contained, the eastern frontier was secured, and the Ottomans had demonstrated that their military system could defeat any army in the Islamic world. The second campaign, in 1516 and 1517, was even more consequential, because it brought the Arab heartlands of Islam under Ottoman rule and transformed the Ottoman Sultan from a regional power into the preeminent sovereign of the Sunni world. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria, the slave warrior state that had ruled the richest provinces of the Arab Middle East for 2.5 centuries, had failed to adapt to the age of gunpowder, and Selim's army, with its firearms and its discipline and its overwhelming artillery, crushed the Mamluks in 2 great battles, Marj-Dabik outside Aleppo and Raidaniya outside Cairo, with a speed that stunned observers on both sides of the Mediterranean. The Mamluk cavalry, which had been the terror of the Crusaders 3 centuries before, broke on the Ottoman guns like waves on a seawall, and the Mamluk Sultan was killed, and Syria and Egypt and the Hejaz, the Red Sea coast of Arabia containing the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, fell into Ottoman hands almost without further resistance. In Cairo, the last Abbasid caliph, the shadowy figure who had been maintained by the Mamluks as a symbol of religious legitimacy for centuries, was taken to Istanbul, and with him passed, in the Ottoman understanding, the caliphate itself, the spiritual leadership of Sunni Islam, which would henceforth be vested in the Ottoman Sultan, an identity that would shape the empire's self-understanding for the rest of its history. The conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate gave the Ottomans something else as well, something that connects to the story of the Spanish Empire and the mountain of silver that we told on another night. Control of the Red Sea and the trade routes to the Indian Ocean, and with them, the strategic position from which the Ottomans would contest the Portuguese for the spice trade of Asia for the next century. Selim died in 1520 of an infection while preparing a new campaign, and he died as he had lived, quickly, violently, leaving behind a single son, because he had eliminated all the others. And that son was Suleyman, who would reign for 46 years, the longest reign of any Ottoman sultan, and who would bring the empire to its zenith. The grim father had done the terrible work of clearing the ground. The magnificent son would build on it. But Selim's legacy was not only the territory he had conquered and the rivals he had eliminated. He had also established, definitively, the pattern of Ottoman sultanic authority that would define the empire for the next century. The sultan as absolute sovereign, answerable to no one, his power unrestrained by any institutional check, his person sacred and terrible and remote. Under a strong sultan, this system was extraordinarily effective, concentrating the full resources of the state on the sultan's objectives, eliminating the factional struggles that paralyzed other monarchies, allowing the empire to pivot rapidly from one front to another, from Persia to Hungary to the Mediterranean, with a strategic coherence that no European power could match. Under a weak sultan, the system would become something else entirely, a vacuum at the center of the state into which every ambitious faction would pour. And the story of the Ottoman decline, when it comes, will be in large part the story of what happened when the throne was occupied by men who could not bear the weight that Selim had placed on it. But we are not yet at the decline. We are at the dawn of the Golden Age, the reign of Suleyman, the age that the Ottomans themselves would remember forever afterward as the measure of all greatness, the yardstick against which every subsequent sultan would be measured and found wanting. The brief, blazing, unrepeatable moment when the empire was the strongest, richest, and most feared state in the world. And before we enter it, we should pause for a moment, here in the quiet, and let ourselves feel the strangeness of what has happened in this story so far. A band of frontier nomads, obscure to the point of invisibility, has become, in 2 centuries, the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Islamic world. A state that began as a holy war against Christendom now rules more Christians than any Christian king, through an administration staffed largely by former Christians. A dynasty that practiced systematic fratricide has achieved a stability of succession that the great houses of Europe envy. And a young sultan, not yet 30, sits on a throne overlooking the Bosphorus, preparing to launch the campaigns that will carry his armies to the gates of Vienna and his fleets to the shores of Italy, convinced, with some reason, that God has given him the world. The strange machine that Osman dreamed of and Mehmed built and Selim sharpened is about to operate at its maximum power, and the results will terrify Europe for a century. That is the story of the next part of our night, and it is where we will resume when you are ready. For now, close your eyes and rest. The sound you can almost hear, if you listen in the dark, is the call to prayer drifting over the domes of Istanbul, the city that was the city, the capital of the world that the Ottomans believed was theirs by right and by destiny, and would be, for a little while longer, theirs in fact, the empire at its noon. We close the last watch of the night with Suleyman newly ascended, the terrible father dead, the empire expanded to the east and south and about to turn its full weight westward, toward Europe, toward the Christian kingdoms that had been the original enemies of the Ottoman frontier and that remained, in the Ottoman imagination, the ultimate prize. Suleyman I, whom the West would call the Magnificent, and his own people would call Kanuni, the lawgiver, ruled from 1520 to 1566, 46 years that contain almost everything the world remembers about the Ottoman Empire at its height. The sieges and the sea battles, the poetry and the architecture, the great viziers and the tragic princes, the alliance with France that scandalized Christendom, and the slow, almost invisible turn, in the last years of the reign, that would set the empire on the long path toward its eventual decline. The reign of Suleyman is the hinge of this whole story, the moment when the Ottoman trajectory shifted from ascent to plateau, and from plateau to the first subtle beginnings of descent, and it deserves to be walked through slowly, campaign by campaign and year by year, because the seeds of everything that followed, the greatness and the tragedy alike, were planted in these 4.5 decades. The first campaigns were westward, into Hungary, because Hungary was the gateway to Central Europe, the buffer between the Ottoman Balkans and the Holy Roman Empire of the Habsburgs, and the young sultan meant to have it. In 1521, he took Belgrade, the great fortress city at the confluence of the Danube and the Sava, which had defied his great-grandfather Mehmed II, and which the Hungarians had considered the key to their southern defense, and the fall of Belgrade opened the Danube corridor into the heart of Hungary. 5 years later, in 1526, he met the main Hungarian army at Mohacs, a plain in southern Hungary, in a battle that lasted perhaps 2 hours, and destroyed the medieval Hungarian kingdom as thoroughly as any kingdom has ever been destroyed in a single afternoon. The Hungarian king, Louis II, the flower of the Hungarian nobility, the bishops and the barons and the armored knights who had been the military class of Hungary for centuries, charged the Ottoman lines and were shattered by the Janissary muskets and the artillery, and the king himself drowned in a stream trying to flee the field, weighed down by his armor, at the age of 20. The road to Vienna was open, and Suleyman, the following year, marched through Hungary and into Austria, and laid siege to the city of Vienna itself, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, the seat of his great rival, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the same Charles whose impossible inheritance we met in the story of the Spanish Empire, the same Charles whose mines in Potosi were, in these very years, beginning to pour their silver into the coffers of Spain. The long duel between the two great empires of the 16th century, the Ottoman and the Habsburg, the Sultan and the Emperor, the Crescent and the Cross, had begun, and it would not end for more than 200 years. The siege of Vienna in 1529 was a failure, and it is worth dwelling on the failure, because it is one of those moments in history that reveal more than the victories. The Ottoman army had marched deep into Central Europe, at the limit of its supply lines, into a country that had been devastated by the previous year's campaign, and the autumn rains had turned the roads to mud, and the heavy siege guns, the great bombards that had smashed the walls of Rhodes and Belgrade, could not be brought up, and the army sat before the walls of Vienna through a wet October, with its supplies running short and its morale sinking and the winter coming on. And Suleyman, who was a great commander but also a practical one, understood that the siege was not going to succeed and ordered the retreat, the first significant Ottoman defeat in Europe in more than a century. The failure of the siege did not break Ottoman power, and the Habsburgs did not pursue, and the frontier stabilized in Hungary, which was partitioned between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs and a rump Hungarian principality of Transylvania, an arrangement that would hold, more or less, for 150 years. But the siege of Vienna marked a limit, and the limit was this: the Ottoman military system, for all its power, could only project force so far from Istanbul before the logistics became impossible, and Vienna, it turned out, was on the wrong side of that line. The empire had reached its maximum territorial extent in the west, and although there would be more campaigns and more victories and more territory gained, the great push into the heart of Europe had stopped, and the Ottoman relationship with the European powers had begun to shift from conquest to something more complicated, something more like great power diplomacy, in which the Ottomans, without ever quite admitting it, were one among several rivals rather than the inevitable conqueror of all. But if the western frontier had stabilized, other frontiers were still expanding, and the other great theater of Suleyman's reign was the Mediterranean, where the Ottoman fleet, built up over the previous decades and now commanded by the greatest admiral of the age, was contesting the Spanish and the Venetians for control of the sea that lay at the center of the world known to Europeans. The admiral was Hayreddin Barbarossa, a name that still echoes in the Mediterranean imagination, a Greek convert from the island of Lesbos who had begun his career as a corsair, a pirate, raiding Christian shipping from the North African coast, and who had risen to become the Capitan Pasha, the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, and who would spend his life fighting the Spanish and their allies across the length and breadth of the inland sea. The Ottoman naval expansion in the 16th century is one of the most remarkable episodes in maritime history, a transformation of a land-based empire into a naval power capable of projecting force across the entire Mediterranean, from the Adriatic to the coast of Spain, from the Black Sea to the shores of North Africa. And it was accomplished by a characteristically Ottoman method. The empire absorbed the naval expertise it needed from the peoples who already had it: Greek sailors, Italian renegades, North African corsairs, the maritime communities of the Mediterranean who knew the winds and the coasts and the harbors, and who were drawn into Ottoman service by the opportunities the empire offered and the weakness of the Christian powers. The Ottoman fleet was, like the Ottoman army, a composite force built of elements from across the empire and beyond it, and it was commanded by men who had learned their trade in the hard school of Mediterranean piracy, and it was, for a generation, the dominant naval power in the sea, raiding the coasts of Italy and Spain, defeating the combined fleets of Venice and the Habsburgs, and establishing Ottoman control over the North African coast from Algeria to Tripoli, which would remain Ottoman, in name at least, until the 19th century. The land frontier in the east was also active during Suleyman's reign, because the Safavid Empire, in Persia, The Shia rival that Selim had defeated at Chaldiran remained a permanent strategic challenge, a state that the Ottomans could never quite defeat and could never ignore. And the eastern campaigns, 3 of them during Suleyman's reign, consumed enormous resources and produced limited results. The Ottomans taking Baghdad and the southern provinces of Iraq, which brought the holy cities of Shia Islam under Ottoman control and established the frontier that would more or less hold between the 2 empires for the next 400 years. The frontier that still separates Turkey from Iran today. The war with Persia was the Ottoman Empire's second front, the distraction that made it impossible for the sultans to concentrate all their forces against Europe, and it was the factor that, more than any other, prevented the Ottomans from achieving the universal dominion they claimed. The empire was simply too large, its frontiers too long, its enemies too numerous, for any one campaign to be decisive, and the sultans spent their reigns moving from one front to another, Hungary to Persia to the Mediterranean, and back to Hungary. Never able to finish any war permanently, always leaving one frontier exposed while the army marched to the other. This was the strategic logic that had trapped Charles V in the same decades, the logic of the overextended empire. And it would grind down the Ottomans as it ground down the Habsburgs slowly over centuries, one campaign season at a time, the lawgiver and his city. But the reign of Suleiman was not only a reign of war, and if we only told the wars, we would miss the thing that made the Ottomans unique among the empires of the age, the thing that made their conquered populations, by and large, accept their rule, and even prefer it to the alternatives. Suleiman was Kanuni, the lawgiver in the Ottoman tradition, and his legal reforms, carried out in collaboration with the great jurist Ebu Suud Effendi, the Sheikhul Islam of his reign, systematized Ottoman law into a coherent code that governed everything from land tenure to criminal penalties to the regulation of the guilds. And that code, the Kanun, operated alongside the Sharia, the sacred law of Islam, in a dual system that gave the Ottoman state a flexibility that purely religious legal systems lacked. The Kanun was the Sultan's law, based on custom and reason and the needs of the state, and it allowed the Ottomans to govern a vast, multi-religious, multi-ethnic empire with a consistency that none of their rivals could match. And the subjects of the empire, Muslim and Christian and Jewish alike, had access to courts that were, by the standards of the age, efficient and predictable, and relatively free from the corruption that plagued the legal systems of contemporary Europe. The Ottoman Empire in the age of Suleiman was not a tyranny in the sense that the word has come to mean. It was a state governed by law, and the law was known, and the law applied, imperfectly but genuinely, to all the Sultan's subjects. And this was one of the things that held the empire together for as long as it held, the sense, shared by its diverse peoples, that the Ottoman system was basically fair, that the Sultan was distant, but his justice was real, that the alternative, the chaos of warring principalities and religious persecution that plagued much of Europe, was worse. And there was Istanbul. The city that Mehmed had conquered was transformed under Suleiman into the capital of the world, the largest and richest city in Europe and the Mediterranean, a city of perhaps 500,000 people when London and Paris were towns of 50,000, a city that gathered the wealth of 3 continents and poured it into the building of mosques and palaces and fountains and baths and markets, the physical fabric of a civilization at its height. The greatest architect of the age, Mimar Sinan, the son of a Christian family from a village in Anatolia, taken in the devshirme as a boy, trained in the palace school, and risen to become the chief architect of the empire, spent his long life, he lived to be nearly 100, building the masterpieces that still define the Istanbul skyline, the Shehzade Mosque, the Süleymaniye, the Selimiye in Edirne, works of such grace and power that they are mentioned in the same breath as the great cathedrals of Europe, the dome of the Süleymaniye rising over the Golden Horn, as a statement in stone that the Ottomans had arrived at the summit of civilizational achievement and intended to stay there. Sinan's mosques are the architecture of an empire that has stopped needing to prove itself and has passed into the confidence of maturity, the confidence that builds not for the moment, but for the ages, and they still stand in the city that is still Istanbul as the most visible surviving testament to what the Ottomans achieved in their golden age. The tragedy of the princes. And then, at the very height of the reign, the story takes a turn that the travelers in the dark with us tonight will recognize, because empires at their height always contain the seeds of their own decline. And in the Ottoman case, the seeds were planted in the harem, in the relationships between the sultan and his women and his sons, in the slow corrosion of the institutions that had built the empire's strength. Suleyman fell in love, deeply, exclusively, fatally, with a woman from his harem, a woman of Ukrainian origin named Hürrem Sultan, whom the West would call Roxolana, and the love story that followed is one of the most extraordinary and consequential in the history of any monarchy. Hürrem became the Sultan's legal wife, breaking the Ottoman tradition that sultans did not marry, and she bore him several children, and she became a political figure in her own right, corresponding with foreign monarchs, patronizing charitable foundations, advising the Sultan on affairs of state and the court and the empire, divided between those who supported her and those who saw her influence as an abomination, a violation of the Sultan's dignity, a sign that the empire was being governed by a woman. The older son, Mustafa, born to an earlier consort, was the favorite of the Janissaries and of the traditionalists, a prince of great promise who was everything an Ottoman sultan was supposed to be: brave, popular, martial, a leader of men. Hürrem's eldest son, Selim, was less impressive, a man who would later be remembered cruelly, if not entirely inaccurately, as Selim the Sot, the drunkard, and Hürrem and her supporters worked, over years, to undermine Mustafa's position and to convince Suleyman that his older son was a threat to his throne, a conspirator who meant to do to his father what Suleyman's own father had done to his grandfather, to seize the throne by force before the old sultan was dead. The tragedy played out slowly, over years, in whispers and letters and the quiet movements of court politics, and it ended in 1553, during a campaign against Persia, when Suleyman summoned his son Mustafa to his tent and had him strangled before his eyes, the Sultan watching from behind a screen while the executioners did their work, and the army, which had loved Mustafa, was barely restrained from mutiny, and the empire, which had been waiting for Mustafa to succeed her father, realized that the succession would not fall on the most capable prince, but on the one who survived. The execution of Mustafa broke something in the Ottoman system, or rather, it revealed something that had already been breaking for a generation. The old system of princely competition, in which the sons of the Sultan were sent to govern provinces and learn the arts of rule and fight one another for the succession, had been replaced by a system in which the princes were confined to the palace, to the harem, to the cage, as the Ottomans called it, and the succession was determined not by merit and victory, but by intrigue and the favor of the Sultan and the machinations of the harem women. The sultans who followed Suleyman would increasingly be men who had spent their entire youth in the enclosed world of the palace, surrounded by women and eunuchs and servants, never tested in battle or administration, never exposed to the world they were supposed to rule, and the quality of the sultans would decline, slowly, generation by generation, in a process that was invisible at the time, because the institutions of the state, built over centuries, could run themselves for long periods without a strong sultan at the top, but that would, in the end, hollow out the empire from within. There is a pattern here, and if you have traveled with this channel through the stories of other empires, you will recognize it before I name it. The institutions that build an empire's greatness are suited to a particular set of conditions, a particular kind of ruler, a particular moment in history, and when those conditions change, the institutions do not change with them. They harden, become rigid, become ends in themselves rather than means to an end, and the flexibility that characterized the empire's rise is lost. The Ottomans, in their golden age, had already begun to lose the habits that had made them great. the habit of innovation, the habit of adaptation, the habit of borrowing from their enemies, the habit of promoting talent regardless of origin. The devshirme, which had been the engine of elite recruitment, was slowly losing its rigor, and the Janissaries, who had been the disciplined core of the army, were beginning to transform into a hereditary caste that would one day become the most reactionary force in the empire, blocking reform and protecting their own privileges against any sultan who tried to modernize. The Ottoman state, at the height of its power under Suleyman, looked invincible, and it would continue to look invincible for another century, because the momentum of the Golden Age was enormous and took a long time to dissipate. But the foundations had already begun to shift, and the cracks, invisible to the men who walked the corridors of Topkapi, would widen, decade by decade, until the whole structure groaned. The last years of Suleiman's reign were marked by a weariness that the chroniclers of the age recorded with a kind of subdued sadness, as though the empire itself was growing old with its sultan. The wars continued, because the logic of the empire demanded war, but they were increasingly inconclusive. The campaigns against the Habsburgs and the Persians ending in negotiated settlements rather than decisive victories, the costs mounting, the treasury strained, the silver of the Americas beginning its long journey through the European economy that would, as we heard on another night, quietly, invisibly, undermine the Ottoman currency as it undermined the Spanish. Suleiman, who had been the most magnificent prince of his age, the terror of Christendom, the lawgiver, the patron of Sinan, the husband of Hurrem, the executioner of his own sons, grew old and tired and increasingly isolated, and in 1566, at the age of 71, he died in his tent during the siege of Sigetvar, a fortress in Hungary held by a Croatian count who had defied the Ottoman army for weeks with a handful of men. A miniature, pointless, emblematic battle that did nothing to change the strategic balance, and that cost the life of the last great sultan of the Ottoman Golden Age. His death was concealed from the army for days, his vizier propping the body up and pretending the sultan was still alive, still commanding, still the center around which the empire turned, while the letters of accession were sent to the one surviving son, Selim, the drunkard, the son of Hurrem, who had won the succession not by merit or by battle, but by being the last one left. And here, if we are honest, is where the long afternoon begins. The reign of Suleiman is the crest of the wave, and everything after it is the long, slow, complicated descent. The 2.5 centuries in which the empire did not so much fall as fade, losing territory and strength and self-confidence in increments so gradual that the people within the empire could always point to some victory or some reform, and reassure themselves that the old greatness was still there, that the decline was manageable, that the sick man of Europe, as the Tsar of Russia would later call it, was not yet sick beyond cure. The story of the Ottoman decline is not a story of a single catastrophe, a single decision, a single fatal error. It is a story of accumulation, of small failures compounding, of institutional decay proceeding at a pace too slow to alarm, of the world changing around an empire that had lost the ability to change with it. And the story is still worth telling in the quiet hours, because the Ottoman Empire was not simply a tyranny that rose and fell. It was one of the most durable and successful political systems in human history, a system that kept the peace among dozens of peoples and faiths for centuries, that produced art and architecture and law and administration of the highest quality, that survived challenges that would have destroyed most states, and that failed in the end, not because it was uniquely wicked or uniquely incompetent, but because all human institutions age, and the Ottoman institutions aged, and the empire's rulers could not or would not admit that age had arrived. But before we enter the long afternoon, let us pause for a moment and look back at what we have covered, because the story so far is the story of one of the most remarkable transformations in history. A band of nomads, obscure and poor, on the farthest fringe of the Islamic world, has become the greatest power in the Mediterranean basin, the inheritor of Rome, the seat of the Caliphate, the terror of Christendom. the patron of a civilization that rivals anything produced in Europe in the same centuries. The institutions that made this possible, the devshirme and the Janissaries, the palace school and the kanun, the tolerance of diversity and the meritocratic administration, were the work of generations of sultans and viziers and jurists and soldiers, men who built something that lasted, something that worked, something that seemed, to the men who lived inside it, to be the natural order of the world. And now the Golden Age is over, and the long, slow, fascinating, melancholy story of what came next is about to begin. That is where we will pick up the thread, when you are ready, with Selim II and the disaster that announced, though nobody quite heard it at the time, that the Ottoman zenith had passed and the descent had begun. For now, close your eyes, and let the dome of the Suleymani rise in your mind's eye against the Istanbul sky, the masterpiece of Sinan, the monument of the Golden Age, beautiful and serene, and already, though no one knew it, a monument to a moment that would never come again, the moment the wheel turned. In the year 1571, 5 years after the death of Suleyman, the Ottoman fleet sailed from Istanbul in the high summer, confident and enormous, 230 ships under the command of the Capudan Pasha, Ali Pasha, a fleet that had been built in the imperial shipyards in a matter of months to replace the losses of the previous year's campaigning, a demonstration of the staggering resources that the Ottoman state could still command, the timber and the canvas and the iron and the men summoned from across the empire and assembled into the instrument of sea power that had terrified the Mediterranean for a generation. The fleet sailed west, raiding the Venetian-held islands and coasts, and in the early autumn it anchored in the Gulf of Patras, on the western coast of Greece, near a small port called Lepanto. And there it waited, because the season was advancing and the admirals expected the Christian fleet, if it came at all, to come there. And in the first week of October, it came. The Battle of Lepanto is one of those rare events that everyone alive at the time understood immediately to be a hinge of history. The Holy League, an alliance of Spain, Venice, and the papacy, had assembled the largest Christian fleet that had ever put to sea, more than 200 galleys and galleasses, the heavy, multi-decked warships that were the latest word in Mediterranean naval architecture, and they caught the Ottoman fleet in the narrow waters off Lepanto and destroyed it in an afternoon. The numbers are uncertain, as the numbers from 16th century battles always are, but the scale is not in doubt. Of the Ottoman ships, the great majority were sunk or captured. Of the Ottoman sailors and soldiers, something like 30,000 were killed, drowned, or taken prisoner. The Capudan Pasha himself was killed in the fighting, his head displayed on a pike, and the Christian slaves who had been chained to the Ottoman oars were freed in their thousands, a liberation that eyewitnesses described as one of the most affecting sights of the age. Men who had been years in bondage, emaciated and scarred, suddenly unshackled and weeping on the decks of the victorious ships. The news, when it reached the courts of Europe, produced an outpouring of joy and relief that had no precedent within living memory. The Ottoman navy, which had seemed invincible, had been broken. The tide, at last, had turned. And then, and this is the part of the story that makes Lepanto so instructive, so strange, so revealing of the strengths and weaknesses of the Ottoman system, the thing that nobody in Europe expected happened. The Ottomans rebuilt the fleet. In a single winter, working through the rain and the cold in the shipyards of Istanbul and Gallipoli, the imperial shipwrights, under the direction of a new Capudan Pasha, the formidable Kilik Ali Pasha, constructed a new fleet, more than 150 ships, and sent it to sea the following spring, larger, in fact, than the fleet that had been lost. Though this was a figure that concealed a critical detail, which was that the new fleet lacked the experienced sailors and archers and marines who had died at Lepanto, and it would take a generation to replace them, and the quality of Ottoman naval power, the human capital that had made Barbarossa's fleet so formidable, had been bled white in the waters off Greece. The Grand Vizier at the time, the brilliant, cynical, worldly Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, is said to have remarked to the Venetian ambassador in the aftermath of the defeat, words that have echoed down the centuries and that contain, in 2 sentences, the whole difference between the Ottoman and European ways of war. You have cut off our arm, and we will grow another. But you have shaved our beard, and it will not grow back. Cyprus, which the Ottomans had taken from Venice in the war that led to Lepanto, was the arm. The loss of the fleet, the ships themselves, was the beard. And the distinction between a permanent territorial gain and a replaceable naval loss was one that the Venetians, who had won the battle and lost the war, understood all too well. But the Grand Vizier's bon mot, memorable as it was, concealed a deeper truth that the story of Lepanto has sometimes obscured. The battle did not, in any immediate sense, weaken the Ottomans. They held Cyprus, and the new fleet restored their naval presence in the Mediterranean, and the war ended more or less on the terms that the Ottomans had wanted. What Lepanto did, more subtly and more permanently, was to demonstrate that the Ottoman military machine was not invincible, that the Europeans could beat them in a pitched battle, and that the technological and organizational gap between the 2 civilizations was narrowing. The Spanish infantry, the tercios, and the Venetian galleasses, and the increasing sophistication of European military finance were beginning to tilt the balance, and although it would take another century for the tilt to become unmistakable, the men who paid attention knew, from 1571 onward, that the age of Ottoman inevitability was over. The empire would continue to win battles, to capture territory, to inspire fear and respect, but it would never again enjoy the aura of irresistible conquest that had carried its armies from the Danube to the Nile. From this point forward, the Ottoman story is a story of effort, of struggle, of the increasing difficulty of simply maintaining what had been won, of the slow, grinding, exhausting work of holding an empire together against a world that was changing faster than the empire could change. The century between Lepanto and the Second Siege of Vienna, between 1571 and 1683, is the part of the Ottoman story that the schoolbooks skip, because it contains no single catastrophe, no world historical turning point, no dramatic fall, and that absence of drama is precisely what makes it worth telling. The empire did not collapse. It endured. It continued to function, to collect taxes, to administer provinces, to fight wars, to produce art and architecture and poetry, to be, in the eyes of its subjects and its enemies, one of the great powers of the earth. And all the while, quietly, incrementally, almost imperceptibly, the foundations were shifting, the institutions were decaying, the advantages that had made the Ottoman rise possible were eroding, and the men at the top, the sultans and the viziers and the military commanders, were either unaware of the erosion or unable to reverse it, caught in a system whose logic they could not escape because they could not see it whole. The Ottoman decline is one of the most instructive episodes in the history of empires because it was not caused by external enemies, or not primarily. It was caused by the internal dynamics of the empire itself, by the slow petrification of institutions that had once been flexible and adaptive, by the accumulation of vested interests that blocked reform, by the changing nature of the world economy and the world's military technology, which the Ottomans, who had once been the great innovators of the age, proved increasingly unable to adopt. The decline was not a collapse, but a long, slow, complicated process, a gathering of disabilities that accumulated over generations until, at some point that no one can precisely date, the empire had passed from being the strongest state in Europe to being the weakest of the great powers, and the predators who had once fled before its armies began to circle, waiting for the moment to strike. The sultans who followed Suleyman were, with a few partial exceptions, not the men the empire needed. They were not for the most part wicked or foolish, and the old Orientalist caricature of the Ottoman Sultan as a degenerate tyrant lounging in the harem has been thoroughly dismantled by modern scholarship. But they were, increasingly, weak, in the specific sense that the Ottoman system of government required a strong sultan at its center and could not function properly without one. The system that Selim the Grim and Suleyman the Magnificent had perfected was a system of personal monarchy, in which all authority flowed from the sultan, in which the sultan was the ultimate decision-maker and the ultimate arbiter and the ultimate source of legitimacy, in which the vast apparatus of the state, the viziers and the judges and the provincial governors and the military commanders were all, in theory at least, extensions of the sultan's will. When the sultan was strong, competent, and engaged, the system worked magnificently, concentrating the full resources of the empire on the sultan's objectives and allowing for decisive action in a way that the divided and feudal polities of Europe could not match. When the sultan was weak, the system had no mechanism for compensating, no institutional check, no independent source of authority that could step into the vacuum. The viziers could govern, and some of them governed very well, but they governed on borrowed authority, always vulnerable to court intrigue, always aware that their power depended on the favor of a sultan who might be swayed by a whisper in the harem or a rumor in the corridor. The system, in other words, had a single point of failure, and the failure, when it came, propagated through the whole structure of the state. Selim II, Suleyman's sole surviving son, reigned for only 8 years, from 1566 to 1574, and it is probably unfair that history remembers him primarily as Selim the Sot, the drunkard, because he was not, by the standards of the age, a catastrophic ruler. He left the business of government largely to his Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, who was one of the ablest administrators in Ottoman history, and the empire continued to function. The fleet was rebuilt after Lepanto, the frontiers were maintained, the revenues kept coming in. But the pattern that Selim established, the pattern of a sultan who reigned rather than ruled, who was a presence rather than a force, who delegated the actual work of governing to viziers and favorites and harem women, would be repeated, with variations, for most of the next century, and the consequences, invisible at first, would accumulate. The sultan was the keystone of the Ottoman arch. Remove the keystone, and the arch could stand for a surprisingly long time, held together by habit and the skill of the secondary officials. But eventually, under stress, it would begin to crumble. Murad III, Selim's son, reigned for 21 years, from 1574 to 1595, and his reign saw the deepening of the pattern and its extension into new areas. Murad was not a drunkard like his father. He was a man of some piety and some culture, but he was dominated by the harem, by his mother, the formidable Nurbanu Sultan, and by his favorite concubine, Safia Sultan. And the politics of the harem, which had been a private matter under Suleyman, became increasingly a public matter, the women of the imperial family exercising political influence openly, building factions, corresponding with foreign powers, and competing with one another for control of the sultan's ear and, through him, of the empire itself. The period that European observers would later call the Sultanate of Women, the century or so in which the women of the Ottoman harem exercised unprecedented political power, had begun. And it is worth saying plainly that the Sultanate of Women was not, as Western observers often depicted it, a symptom of Oriental decadence. It was a rational response to the problem of weak sultans. When the sultan could not or would not perform his functions, someone had to perform them, and the women of the harem, who had the advantage of proximity and intimacy, and who understood the workings of the palace as no one else did, stepped into the gap. Some of them governed very well, some of them governed badly, but their existence as political actors was a symptom of the underlying problem, which was that the Sultanate had become a passive institution, a role performed by men who were not capable of the active leadership the system required. The long war against the Habsburgs that dominated Murad's reign, the war of 1593 to 1606, which the Ottomans called the Long Turkish War and the Europeans called the Long War, revealed, for the first time on a large scale, what the erosion of the Sultan's authority had done to the Ottoman military system. The Janissaries, who had been the disciplined core of the Ottoman army, had become, by the end of the 16th century, something their founders would not have recognized. The prohibitions against marriage and property ownership had been relaxed, then abandoned. The Janissaries now married, raised families, engaged in trade, and the barracks had become a hereditary corporation, with Janissaries' sons succeeding their fathers, and the old meritocratic recruitment through the devshirme falling into disuse. The corps had swollen enormously, from perhaps 12,000 men under Suleyman to nearly 40,000 by the end of the century. But the growth was not in fighting strength, but in numbers on the payroll. Men who had purchased their positions or inherited them and who had no intention of risking their lives in battle. Men who drew their salaries and pursued their trades and formed a powerful, entrenched interest group that would resist, violently if necessary, any attempt to reform them. The battlefield performance of the Janissaries declined accordingly, and the Ottoman army, which had been the terror of Europe, found itself increasingly matched and sometimes beaten by the Habsburg forces, who had spent the preceding decades learning the lessons of the Ottoman military revolution and developing their own firearms and their own infantry tactics. The long war ended in 1606 with the Treaty of Zitvatorok, which was, on paper, a compromise, but which was understood on both sides as a significant Ottoman concession. For the first time, the Habsburg emperor was treated as an equal of the sultan, not as a tributary who received the sultan's peace on the sultan's terms. The psychological impact of the treaty was enormous, because it announced, more clearly than any battle, that the Ottomans were no longer the dominant power in Central Europe, that the empire of the sultans was now one great power among several, negotiating on terms of equality with a Christian emperor, whom the earlier sultans would have dismissed as a petty king. The 17th century, the century that followed, was the century in which the Ottoman decline became visible to anyone who cared to look, and the empire produced, in response, a series of attempts at reform that deserve more attention than they usually receive, because they demonstrate, contrary to the stereotype of an empire sunk in stagnation, that there were always Ottomans who saw what was happening and tried to stop it, tried to restore the old institutions to their original purpose, tried to adapt the empire to the changing world. The reformers, the Qadizadeles and the Köprülü viziers, the sultans like Osman II and Murad IV, who attempted to reassert the authority of the throne, are the protagonists of the 17th century Ottoman story, and their failures, as instructive as their occasional successes, tell us what we need to know about why the empire could not reverse its decline. The obstacles to reform were not primarily intellectual. The Ottomans understood, as well as their European contemporaries, that their military and administrative systems needed to change. The obstacles were political, structural, embedded in the vested interests that the old system had created. The Janissaries who would not be disbanded, the religious scholars who would not countenance innovation, the court factions who would not surrender their privileges, the provincial notables who had built local power bases that the central government could not challenge, the entire tangled, interlocking network of interests that had grown up around the Ottoman state over 2 centuries, and that would resist, with every tool available, any change that threatened their position. The first great reform attempt of the century came from Osman II, who ascended the throne in 1618 at the age of 14. A serious, intelligent, determined boy who had absorbed the lessons of the Long War and who understood that the Janissaries had become a liability. He proposed to abolish the corps and replace it with a new army recruited from Anatolia, a return to the military system of the empire's great age, and the Janissaries, who understood perfectly well what he intended, struck first. In 1622, they mutinied, seized the palace, captured the young sultan, and murdered him, strangling him in the fortress of Yedikul, the first regicide in Ottoman history, an act that announced with shocking clarity that the sultan was no longer the master of his own soldiers, that the empire's own military had become a force that the sultan could not control. The murder of Osman II was a turning point in the internal history of the empire, because it demonstrated that reform from above, the traditional method by which Ottoman sultans had adapted the state to changing circumstances, was no longer possible. The institutions that needed to be reformed were strong enough to kill any sultan who tried, and the sultans who followed Osman learned the lesson, and most of them chose to survive rather than to challenge the forces that had murdered their predecessor. The most effective response to the crisis of the 17th century came not from the sultans, but from the viziers, specifically from the Köprülü family, a dynasty of grand viziers who dominated the Ottoman government for much of the second half of the century and who attempted, with considerable success, to arrest the decline through administrative reform and military discipline. The first of them, Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, was appointed Grand Vizier in 1656 at the age of nearly 80 by the mother of the young Sultan Mehmed IV, who was desperate to restore order to an empire that was spiraling into chaos. The Venetian fleet was blockading the Dardanelles, the provincial governors were in revolt, the treasury was empty, the Janissaries were running riot in the capital. Köprülü accepted the position on conditions that no Grand Vizier had ever dared to demand: absolute authority, no interference from the palace, no countermanding of his orders, no dismissal without cause. The conditions were granted, and Köprülü set to work with a ruthlessness that recalled the great sultans of the Golden Age, executing thousands of corrupt officials and rebellious soldiers, restoring discipline to the army, purging the factions that had paralyzed the government, and turning back the Venetian threat in a series of naval campaigns. By the time he died, 5 years later, he had stabilized the empire, and he had done it not by changing the system, but by restoring it, by forcing the old institutions to function as they had been designed to function, by a sheer, brutal act of will. It was an impressive achievement, and it was also, in the long run, an unsustainable one, because it depended on the presence of a single determined man at the top, and when that man was gone, the forces of decay resumed their work. Köprülü Mehmed was succeeded by his son, Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, who governed for the next 15 years with somewhat less brutality and somewhat more vision, and who presided over the last great Ottoman military success in Europe, the conquest of Crete from the Venetians, a war that lasted 24 years and that ended in 1669 with the island in Ottoman hands, the last major territorial acquisition the empire would ever make in the West. The Köprülü viziers had restored Ottoman military effectiveness, at least temporarily, and the restoration produced, by the early 1680s, a renewed confidence in the empire's capacity for expansion, a confidence that would lead, with the terrible logic that we have seen before in this story, to the catastrophe that would undo everything the Köprülüs had achieved. The Second Siege of Vienna in 1683 is one of the most famous episodes in Ottoman history, and it is famous for good reason, because it marked the definitive end of Ottoman expansion into Europe and the beginning of the long retreat that would continue, with interruptions, for the next 2 centuries. The Grand Vizier who led the campaign, Kara Mustafa Pasha, was a product of the Köprülü system, a protege of the family who had risen through the ranks of the administration, and he convinced the Sultan, Mehmed IV, that the moment had come to complete the conquest that Suleyman had left unfinished a century and a half before. The Ottoman army, perhaps 100,000 men, marched up the Danube in the summer of 1683 through a Hungary that had been contested between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs for generations, and laid siege to Vienna, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire and the symbolic heart of Christian resistance to the Ottoman advance. The siege lasted 2 months, through July and August and into September, and the defenders, a garrison of perhaps 15,000 men under the command of the German general Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, held out with a desperation that the Viennese remember to this day, their supplies dwindling, their walls crumbling under the Ottoman bombardment, their hope sustained only by the knowledge that a relief army was gathering in the German lands, and that if they could hold out just a little longer, if the Grand Vizier would delay his final assault just a few more days, the siege might be broken. The relief army came on the 12th of September, and it was led by the King of Poland, John III Sobieski, a veteran commander who had spent his life fighting the Ottomans on the Ukrainian frontier and who had brought his Polish cavalry, the famous winged hussars, across the mountains to join the combined forces of the Holy Roman Empire. The battle that followed, the Battle of Vienna, was one of the largest and most decisive of the 17th century, the largest cavalry charge in history. Sobieski's 18,000 horsemen sweeping down from the hills around the city and crashing into the Ottoman lines with a force that broke the besieging army in a matter of hours. Kara Mustafa fled the field, abandoning his camp and his treasure and his artillery, and the Ottoman retreat became a rout, and the rout became a collapse. And by the time the army reassembled in the Ottoman Balkans, it had lost something like 40,000 men, and the aura of invincibility that had survived Lepanto and the long war and everything the 17th century had thrown at the empire. The Grand Vizier was executed for his failure, strangled on the Sultan's orders in Belgrade that December. But the punishment of a single commander could not undo the strategic damage that the defeat had caused. The Holy League that had saved Vienna did not disband. It pursued the retreating Ottomans down the Danube, capturing Buda and the rest of Ottoman Hungary, pushing into the Balkans, driving the Ottoman frontier back toward Istanbul itself. And by the time the war ended, in 1699, with the Treaty of Karlowitz, the empire had lost, for the first time in its history, vast territories in Europe. Hungary, Transylvania, much of Croatia and Slavonia, the lands that had been the Ottoman bridgehead into Central Europe for 2 centuries, surrendered. In a treaty negotiated by a sultan's representatives, sitting across a table from Christian diplomats, on terms that the Ottomans had not dictated but had been forced to accept. The psychological shock of Karlowitz was even greater than the territorial loss, because it forced the Ottomans to acknowledge, for the first time, that they were no longer the offensive power, that the age of conquest was over, that the future would be a struggle to hold what they had rather than to gain what they did not. The empire had entered its long afternoon, and the afternoon would last 2 centuries, and the sun, for all the false dawns and the reforming viziers and the occasional victories, would never truly rise again. The internal logic of the decline. Before we follow the empire into the 18th century, into the era of the Tulip period and the wars with Russia, and the first serious attempts at westernization, we should pause, as we have paused before in this story, to understand the forces that were driving the decay, because the battles and the territorial losses were symptoms, not causes, and the causes were structural, and they took a long time to do their work. The first and most fundamental cause was economic, and it connects, in ways that the Ottomans themselves only dimly understood, to the story of the Spanish silver that we told on another night. The discovery of the Americas and the flood of silver and gold into the European economy had, by the late 16th century, reached the Ottoman Empire as well. But it arrived not as wealth but as inflation, the same inflation that was hollowing out the Spanish economy, arriving through trade and warfare and the debasement of coinage. In the Ottoman markets, where prices rose, wages stagnated, and the fixed incomes of the Janissaries and the religious scholars and the provincial cavalry were eroded, year after year, by a force that no one could control because no one entirely understood it. The Ottoman treasury, like the Spanish treasury, responded to the fiscal crisis in the worst possible way, by debasing the currency, issuing coins with less silver and demanding the same taxes in the new, lighter coinage, a policy that produced short-term revenue and long-term chaos, driving the prices higher, undermining trust in the currency, and forcing the government to debase again in a spiral that repeated itself through the 17th and 18th centuries. The second cause was military, and it was the other side of the inflation problem. The European states, driven by their own intense military competition, were developing new technologies and new organizational forms that the Ottomans, despite repeated attempts, could not successfully imitate. The military revolution of early modern Europe, the development of disciplined infantry armed with muskets, of modern fortifications that could resist artillery, of navies that could project power across the oceans, of financial systems that could fund standing armies on a scale no previous age had imagined, was transforming the nature of warfare, and the Ottomans, who had been the innovators of the 16th century, were falling behind. The Janissaries, who had been the model for European infantry, became the obstacle to its modernization, a hereditary caste that resisted every attempt to retrain them or rearm them or replace them with soldiers who could fight in the new way. The Ottoman artillery, which had been the terror of the age of Mehmed the Conqueror, fell behind European standards, its guns heavier and less accurate, its tactics outdated, its engineers working from manuals that had not been updated in a century. The Ottoman cavalry, which had been the striking arm of the classical Ottoman army, became increasingly irrelevant on a battlefield dominated by firearms. But the Timariyat system, the land grants that supported the cavalry, could not be reformed without alienating the class that it supported. And the class was large and politically connected and had no intention of being reformed out of existence. The third cause was administrative, and it was, in some ways, the most fundamental, because the Ottoman state had been, at its height, an astonishingly efficient mechanism for mobilizing resources, and that mechanism was slowly breaking down. The tax collection system, which had once been centrally controlled and relatively honest, devolved in the 17th and 18th centuries into tax farming, a system in which the right to collect taxes was sold to private individuals who paid the state a fixed sum and then extracted whatever they could from the peasantry, pocketing the difference and destroying the agricultural base on which the entire fiscal system rested. The provincial governors, who had once been appointed from the center and rotated frequently to prevent the accumulation of local power, became increasingly autonomous, building local power bases and dynasties that the sultan could not easily displace. And the empire, which had been highly centralized under the great sultans, became a patchwork of semi-autonomous regions in which the center's authority was nominal and its revenues were declining. The consequence was a fiscal crisis that fed on itself. The state could not collect enough revenue to pay its army, so it debased the currency. The debasement drove inflation, which reduced the real value of the revenues it did collect. The declining revenues forced the state to sell tax farms, which reduced future revenues, and the cycle repeated year after year, decade after decade, while the empire's rivals in Europe were building the modern fiscal military states that would dominate the 19th century. And the fourth cause, the one that underlay all the others, was cultural and psychological, the slow closing of the Ottoman mind that we saw in the Spanish story, and that seems to afflict every great empire at a certain point in its trajectory. The Ottomans, who had once been eager borrowers of every useful thing they encountered, Greek fire and Italian shipbuilding, Hungarian cannon founders and Persian poetry, entered a long period of cultural defensiveness, a conviction that their own civilization was self-sufficient, that the infidel world had nothing to teach, that the way things had been done in the Golden Age was the way they should always be done. The printing press, which had revolutionized the circulation of knowledge in Europe, was resisted in the Ottoman Empire for more than 2 centuries, the religious scholars arguing that the Word of God must be written by hand. And although a Hebrew press operated in Istanbul and an Armenian press followed, the printing of Turkish and Arabic was not permitted until the early 18th century, and even then it was limited and contested and never achieved the transformative effect that it had achieved in Europe. The result was that the Ottoman literate class, the men who governed the empire and interpreted its laws and taught its youth, operated in an intellectual world that was increasingly isolated from the main currents of the age, unaware of the scientific revolution that was remaking the European understanding of nature, unaware of the political philosophy that was remaking the European understanding of the state, unaware, in the deepest sense, that the world had changed and that the empire they served had not changed with it. The tulip period. And yet, and this is the strangeness that makes the Ottoman story so difficult to tell simply, the empire did not feel itself declining. The 18th century, which was, in retrospect, a century of steady territorial loss and institutional decay, felt to many of the people living through it like a century of relative peace and prosperity, a welcome respite from the endless wars of the 17th century, an era of cultural refinement and economic recovery, and the first decades of the century in particular, the reign of Ahmed III, from 1703 to 1730, are remembered in Ottoman history as the Leyl Devri, the tulip period, a name that evokes the pleasure gardens and the poetry recitals and the illuminated manuscripts of an age that was, in its own self-understanding, an age of cultivated leisure and refined taste. The tulip, which had been brought from the Ottoman Empire to Europe in the 16th century and had become an emblem of luxury in the Netherlands, was reintroduced to the Ottoman court as a symbol of the new elegance, and the gardens of the Sultan's palaces were planted with tulips in extraordinary variety and profusion, and the tulip parties, illuminated by lanterns and accompanied by music and poetry, became the emblem of an era that was determined to enjoy the peace that the century's borders had provided, to savor the pleasures of civilization, to forget, for a little while, the losses of the previous century and the gathering threats of the next one. The tulip period was, in many ways, the first Ottoman experiment with westernization, because the court of Ahmed III had begun to look to Europe for models of architecture and decoration and entertainment, sending ambassadors to Paris and Vienna who returned with accounts of European palaces and European gardens and European manners. And the Sultan built new palaces that imitated European models, and the courtiers wore French fashions, and the printing press, at last, was introduced, and a small circle of intellectuals and courtiers began to imagine that the empire could adopt the refinements of Europe without adopting the substance, could borrow the surface without changing the structure. The experiment ended, as Ottoman experiments with reform so often ended, in violence. In 1730, a rebellion led by an Albanian Janissary named Patrona Halil, a rebellion of the small people, the bathhouse attendants and the barbers and the disaffected soldiers who resented the luxury of the court and the westernizing tendencies of the Sultan, stormed the palaces of the grandees, killed the Grand Vizier, and forced Ahmed III to abdicate in favor of his nephew Mahmud I, who restored order by executing Patrona Halil and his followers, but who also learned the lesson that the rebellion had taught, that reform, however mild, however superficial, would be resisted by the men who had power under the old system, and that a sultan who pushed too far would share the fate of Osman II a century before. The Russian threat. The other great development of the 18th century, the one that would shape Ottoman foreign policy for the next 200 years, was the rise of Russia. The Tsarist Empire, which had been a distant, half-Asiatic power on the Ottoman northern frontier, had transformed itself, under Peter the Great and his successors, into a European great power, a military state with a modern army and a modern navy, and an appetite for expansion that was directed primarily at the Ottoman territories on the Black Sea. The wars between the Ottomans and the Russians, which began in the later 17th century and continued, with intervals, for the next 200 years, were a series of Ottoman defeats punctuated by occasional, hard-fought stalemates, and they demonstrated, more clearly than any other development, the growing gap between Ottoman and European military capacity. The Russian army, organized on European lines, with modern artillery and modern logistics and modern command structures, repeatedly outmatched the Ottoman forces, which were still organized, in essentials, on the model that Suleyman had taken to Vienna 2 centuries before, and the peace treaties that ended each war, the Treaty of Küçük Kaynarca in 1774, the Treaty of Jassy in 1792, registered the shift of power in the most concrete possible terms. The Ottomans lost the Crimea, the first predominantly Muslim territory to fall to a Christian power. They lost the northern coast of the Black Sea, which had been an Ottoman lake since the time of Mehmed the Conqueror. They lost the right to maintain a fleet on the sea that had been the Ottoman strategic highway for centuries. And they lost, most painfully of all, the claim to be the protector of the Ottoman Empire's Orthodox Christian subjects, a claim that the Russian Tsar now asserted for himself, and that would provide the pretext for Russian intervention in Ottoman affairs for the next century and a half. The loss of the Crimea was a particular wound, and it is worth pausing over it, because the Crimea had been for centuries the Ottoman Ukraine, the source of the cavalry that had ridden with the sultans to Vienna and Persia, the place where Ottoman and steppe traditions merged, the homeland of the Crimean Tatars who had been the empire's most reliable allies and its most formidable raiders. The loss of the Crimea meant that the Russian frontier was now a few days' sail from Istanbul, that the Black Sea was no longer an Ottoman sanctuary, but a contested waterway, and that the empire's northern defenses were permanently compromised, vulnerable to a Russian descent that might, if the Russians ever organized it properly, threaten the capital itself. The psychological impact of the Russian wars was even greater than the territorial losses, because the Russians were not like the Habsburgs, an old rival that the Ottomans had been fighting for centuries on more or less equal terms. They were a new power, a power that had risen from obscurity in the lifetime of the empire, and their rise demonstrated more clearly than any essay or memorandum that the world had changed, and that the Ottomans had not changed with it. Selim III and the New Order, the response to the Russian threat and to the broader challenge of European military superiority, came at last, at the very end of the 18th century, in the form of the most serious reform attempt that the Ottoman Empire had ever undertaken. And its story deserves to be told in some detail, because it illustrates, with painful clarity, the obstacles that confronted any Ottoman reformer and the price that reform exacted from the men who attempted it. Selim III, who became Sultan in 1789, the year of the French Revolution, was a serious, intelligent, thoughtful man, a poet and a musician, as well as a soldier, who had been corresponding with European courts from his seclusion in the palace, and who had concluded, before he ever took the throne, that the empire could not survive without fundamental military reform. His program, which he called the Nizam-ul-Jadid, the New Order, aimed to create a new army, trained and equipped on European lines, with European instructors and European uniforms and European tactics, an army that would eventually replace the Janissaries and restore Ottoman military effectiveness to the level of the European powers. The New Order army was formed, trained, and tested in the field, and it performed well, demonstrating in a series of engagements that Ottoman soldiers, when properly trained and led, could match European troops in battle. And Selim, encouraged by these successes, began to expand the program, to build the institutions that would support the new army, the modern weapons factories and the engineering schools and the reformed tax system that would pay for it all. And then, in 1807, the Janissaries, who had been watching the growth of the new order with increasing alarm, understanding perfectly well that the new army was meant to replace them, rose in revolt as they had risen against Osman II 2 centuries before, and Selim, who lacked the ruthlessness to crush them preemptively, hesitated, and the hesitation was fatal. The rebels seized the capital, drove Selim from the throne, and installed his cousin, Mustafa IV, as their puppet. And the following year, when Selim's supporters attempted to restore him, Mustafa had him murdered, strangled in the palace, the second reforming sultan to be killed by the forces of the old order. The new order was abolished, its soldiers dispersed, its weapons destroyed, its schools closed, and the empire, which had been offered a chance at renewal, relapsed into stagnation, the old order apparently triumphant, the Janissaries seemingly invincible, the pattern of aborted reform and violent reaction repeating itself with a terrible regularity that by now, in this story, we have come to recognize. But the pattern was about to break, and this time it would break in a way that the Janissaries did not expect and could not resist, because the man who would finally reform the Ottoman military had learned the lesson that Selim III had not learned, or had not been willing to apply, that reform could not be gradual, that the old institutions could not be reformed, that they had to be destroyed, completely, violently, without warning, in a single stroke that left no possibility of resistance. The man who would deliver that stroke, the most ruthless and effective of all the Ottoman reformers, was the governor of the Ottoman province of Egypt, an Albanian soldier of fortune, named Mehmed Ali, or, as we will meet him when we continue, the man who almost destroyed the Ottoman Empire and almost saved it in the same decade, by the same methods, and whose story is the bridge between the long afternoon of the 18th century and the convulsions of the 19th, the century of reform and revolution, and the final, protracted, heartbreaking dissolution of the Empire of Osman. But that is a story for the next watch of the night. when we will follow the Ottomans through their last century, through the destruction of the Janissaries and the Tanzimat reforms, and the Young Turk Revolution and the disaster of the First World War, to the quiet morning in 1922, when the last sultan packed his bags and walked out of the palace and into exile, and the empire that had lasted 600 years was no more. For now, rest. The afternoon is long, and the dusk is still distant, and there is much yet to tell. The 19th century was, for the Ottoman Empire, a century of extraordinary paradox, a century in which the empire lost more territory than in any previous century, and simultaneously transformed itself more thoroughly than in any previous century. A century in which the old institutions were finally dismantled and new institutions erected in their place. A century in which the empire, which had been the sick man of Europe, repeatedly surprised the powers that were waiting for it to die by refusing to die, by reforming, by fighting back, by generating out of its own internal resources new sources of strength and new forms of legitimacy. The paradox is worth stating plainly at the outset, because the conventional narrative of Ottoman decline, which presents the empire as a passive victim of European imperialism, steadily dismembered by the great powers, misses the essential reality. The Ottoman Empire in the 19th century was a dynamic society, full of energy and conflict and debate, and its rulers, the sultans and the viziers and the reformers who surrounded them, were not passive spectators of their own dissolution, but active, often desperate, always contested agents of transformation, who understood the threat that the European powers posed and who attempted, with varying degrees of success, to meet it by reshaping their own state. The tragedy of the Ottoman reform movement was not that it failed. In many respects, it succeeded, building a modern army and a modern bureaucracy and a modern educational system and a modern legal code. The tragedy was that the reforms came too late, and the external pressures were too great, and the internal contradictions were too deep, and the European powers, who had an interest in the empire's weakness, never allowed the reformers the time and the space they needed to complete their work. The first and most dramatic of the reforms was the destruction of the Janissaries, the event that the Ottomans would call the Vaka-i Hayriye, the auspicious incident, a name that suggests, with Ottoman irony, that the slaughter of thousands of men could be auspicious if it cleared the way for the empire's survival. The sultan who ordered the slaughter was Mahmud II, who had ascended the throne in 1808, in the aftermath of the Janissary revolt that had killed Selim III, and who had spent the next 18 years waiting and planning and building his strength and his political support, watching the Janissaries demonstrate, campaign after campaign, that they were no longer a military force but a parasitic corporation that consumed the empire's revenues and contributed nothing to its defense. In 1826, Mahmud struck. He had prepared the ground carefully, securing the support of the religious scholars, who issued a fatwa declaring that the Janissaries had betrayed their duty and forfeited their right to exist, and he had raised a new army, the Eshkinchi, the victorious, modeled on the European pattern, and he gave the Janissaries an ultimatum: accept the new army and submit to its discipline, or face the consequences. The Janissaries, as they had done so many times before, rose in revolt, gathering in their barracks and overturning their soup kettles, the traditional signal of mutiny, and this time, Mahmud did not negotiate and did not hesitate. He gave the order that no previous sultan had dared to give. The barracks were surrounded by the new troops, loyalist forces, and the civilian population of Istanbul, which had long since lost any affection for the Janissaries, who had become, in the eyes of ordinary people, more like an extortion racket than an army. The barracks were set on fire, and the men trapped inside were burned, and those who fled were cut down in the streets, and by the time the killing was done, some thousands of Janissaries were dead, and the corps itself was abolished, its name struck from the records, its privileges revoked, its memory, in time, systematically erased. The auspicious incident was a massacre. And it was also, by any honest reckoning, the precondition for everything that followed. Without the destruction of the Janissaries, no military reform was possible, and without military reform, no other reform was possible, because the European powers would have carved up the empire at their leisure, as they had already begun to carve it on its frontiers, province by province, year by year. The Egyptian challenge. The destruction of the Janissaries, however, did not immediately produce the military revival that Mahmud had hoped for, because the new army that he had built to replace them was still raw and untested, and the empire's most dangerous enemy at that moment was not a European power but an Ottoman subject, the governor of Egypt, Mehmed Ali Pasha, the Albanian adventurer who had taken control of Egypt in the chaos that followed the French withdrawal at the beginning of the century, and who had built, in the province that was nominally his to govern on the Sultan's behalf, a state within the state, a modern military power that was, in many respects, more advanced than the empire it supposedly served. Mehmed Ali had reformed the Egyptian army on European lines with French instructors and modern weapons, and he had built a navy, and he had industrialized the Egyptian economy to support his military ambitions, and he had sent his armies south into the Sudan and east into Arabia. And in the 1830s, having grown impatient with the Sultan's refusal to reward his services with the territory he believed he had earned, he turned his army north against his own sovereign and invaded Syria, defeating the Ottoman forces sent to stop him and advancing into Anatolia, toward Istanbul itself, with the apparent intention of replacing the Ottoman dynasty with his own. The Sultan, in desperation, appealed to the European powers for help, and the Russians, who had their own reasons for wanting to keep the Ottoman Empire intact, sent a fleet and an army to the Bosphorus, and the British, alarmed by the Russian intervention, brokered a settlement that left Mehmed Ali in control of Egypt and Syria, but stopped short of dismembering the empire. The settlement, the Convention of London of 1840, was a humiliation for the Sultan, who had been forced to accept the help of the infidel powers to suppress a rebellious servant, and it was also a demonstration of the new reality of Ottoman foreign policy. The empire could no longer defend itself with its own resources, and its survival depended on the balance of power among the European states, on their willingness to keep the empire alive, because they could not agree on how to divide it. Mahmud II died in 1839, worn out by the struggles of his reign. But the reform movement that he had begun, haltingly, violently, against enormous resistance, was continued and deepened by his son, Abdulmecid I, and by the generation of reforming officials who surrounded him, the men who would give the Ottoman 19th century its distinctive character, the Tanzimat, the reorganization, the most sustained and comprehensive program of reform that any Islamic state had ever attempted. The Tanzimat era, which began formally with the proclamation of the Gulhan Edict in 1839 and continued for the next 4 decades, aimed to transform the Ottoman state from a patrimonial empire, in which the Sultan's authority was personal and arbitrary, into a modern, bureaucratic, legal rational state, in which the rights of subjects were defined by law and the administration was conducted by trained officials according to fixed procedures. The reforms touched every aspect of Ottoman life. The legal system was secularized, with new commercial and penal codes based on French models. The tax system was reformed, replacing the old tax farming with direct collection by salaried officials. The provincial administration was reorganized, with new provinces governed by appointed governors advised by councils that included representatives of the local population. The military was further modernized, with conscription introduced to replace the old system of recruitment. And, most radically of all, the principle of legal equality among the Sultan's subjects, regardless of religion, was proclaimed. The old Islamic hierarchy in which Muslims were the dominant community and Christians and Jews were protected but subordinate, formally abolished in favor of a new Ottoman citizenship that was, in theory, blind to faith. The Tanzimat reforms were, in their ambition and their scope, astonishing, and they produced real changes in the way the empire was governed and the way its subjects lived. The new bureaucracy, trained in the new secular schools that the reformers established, created a class of Ottoman officials who were loyal to the state rather than to their religious communities, who spoke French as well as Ottoman Turkish, who read European newspapers and European political philosophy, and who imagined that the empire could be saved by the application of European administrative science. The new legal system, with its secular courts and its codified laws, provided Ottoman subjects with protections that they had never enjoyed under the old system, and the new principle of equality, however imperfectly enforced, opened opportunities for Christians and Jews that had been closed to them under the old Islamic dispensation. The cities of the empire, Istanbul and Salonika and Beirut and Izmir, were transformed by the reforms, their populations growing, their economies integrating with the European capitalist system, their architecture reflecting the new taste for European styles, their cultural life enriched by the newspapers and the theaters and the literary salons that the reforms made possible. And yet, and this is the paradox that runs through the entire Tanzimat period, the reforms did not save the empire. They may even, in some respects, have weakened it, because they undermined the old sources of legitimacy, the Islamic character of the state and the personal authority of the sultan, without creating new sources of legitimacy that were strong enough to replace them. The Equality Edicts of 1839 and 1856, which proclaimed that all Ottoman subjects were equal before the law, were intended to create a common Ottoman citizenship that would bind the empire's diverse peoples together. But they had the opposite effect. The Muslims, who had been the dominant community, resented the loss of their privileged status, and the Christians, who had been the subordinate community, were not satisfied by legal equality and demanded national autonomy or independence, encouraged by the European powers who had their own designs on Ottoman territory. The Tanzimat reformers, in their eagerness to adopt European models, had assumed that the European formula of legal equality and centralized administration would work in the Ottoman context, but they had not reckoned with the depth of communal feeling, the way that religious identity had structured Ottoman society for centuries, the difficulty of creating a civic nationalism in a state whose peoples had always defined themselves by religion rather than by territory or language. The other great problem of the Tanzimat was economic, and it was the problem that had been growing since the 16th century, and that the reforms, for all their ambition, could not solve: the integration of the Ottoman economy into the European capitalist system on terms that were, for the Ottomans, deeply disadvantageous. The commercial treaties that the empire had signed with the European powers, the capitulations, gave European merchants and their Ottoman protégés exemptions from Ottoman taxes and Ottoman courts that made it impossible for Ottoman manufacturers to compete. And the empire, which had once been a significant producer of textiles and other manufactured goods, became, over the course of the 19th century, an exporter of raw materials and an importer of finished goods, its economy increasingly shaped by the needs of European industry rather than by its own internal logic. The Tanzimat state, which needed revenue to fund its reforms and its military, borrowed from European banks on terms that became more onerous with each loan. And by the 1870s, the empire was bankrupt, its revenues assigned to a European-controlled public debt administration that collected the taxes and paid the creditors before any money reached the Sultan's treasury. The irony was bitter and inescapable. The reforms that were supposed to strengthen the empire had left it financially dependent on the very European powers from whom the reforms were supposed to protect it: the sick man and the Eastern question. The phrase that defined the Ottoman Empire in the European imagination of the 19th century, the sick man of Europe, was coined, according to the usual story, by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia in a conversation with the British ambassador in 1853, and it captured with the cruel precision of a well-turned phrase the dilemma that the European powers confronted when they looked at the Ottoman Empire. It was clearly dying, its territories falling away piece by piece, its finances in ruins, its military barely able to hold its own against the smaller Balkan states that had once been its tributaries. But its death, if it came suddenly, would produce a scramble for the spoils that might lead to a general European war. And so the powers, reluctantly, ambivalently, kept the sick man alive, propping up his government with loans and diplomatic support, while simultaneously carving off pieces of his territory when they could do so without provoking a crisis. The Eastern Question, the diplomatic conundrum that preoccupied the European chancelleries for the entire century, was simply this: what should be done with the Ottoman Empire, and who should get what when it finally collapsed, and how could the collapse be managed without destroying the European balance of power? The Crimean War, which broke out in 1853 and ended in 1856, was the Eastern Question made flesh. A war that began as a dispute between Russia and the Ottomans over the protection of the Christian holy places in Palestine, and that became, almost at once, a general European war. The British and the French intervening on the Ottoman side to prevent Russia from destroying the empire and establishing its own control over the straits in the eastern Mediterranean. The war, fought in the Crimea, in the Caucasus, and the Baltic, was a catastrophe for all the combatants. Hundreds of thousands of men dying of disease as much as of battle. But the outcome, the Treaty of Paris of 1856, was a temporary reprieve for the Ottomans. Russia was pushed back, the Black Sea was neutralized, and the empire was admitted, formally, to the concert of Europe, the community of European powers that had been the arbiter of international affairs since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The admission was, in theory, a guarantee of the empire's territorial integrity, a pledge by the great powers to protect it from further Russian aggression, and the Ottoman reformers used the breathing space that the war had won to accelerate their program, issuing the Reform Edict of 1856, which deepened the promises of the Tanzimat and which was, in part, a payment for the British and French support, a demonstration to the European powers that the empire was reforming itself and deserved their continued protection. But the breathing space did not last. The next great crisis of the Eastern Question came in the 1870s, when the Christian peasants of Bosnia and Bulgaria rose in revolt against Ottoman rule, and the Ottoman government, which had lost control of the situation, sent irregular troops, the Bashabazuks, to suppress the rebellion. And the Bashabazuks, undisciplined and unpaid and driven by the sectarian hatreds of the frontier, committed atrocities that the European press reported in horrified detail, the Bulgarian horrors, as the British Liberal leader Gladstone called them in a pamphlet that sold 200,000 copies and destroyed the British government's willingness to support the Ottomans. The Russians, who had been waiting for such a moment, declared war in 1877, and the Russian army, after a hard campaign that was by no means the walkover that St. Petersburg had expected, broke through the Ottoman defenses in the Balkans and advanced to the suburbs of Istanbul, where the Sultan signed the Treaty of San Stefano, which created a greater Bulgaria under Russian protection and would have reduced the Ottoman presence in Europe to a rump around the capital. The other European powers, alarmed by the Russian gains, convened the Congress of Berlin in 1878, where Bismarck, the German chancellor, presided over the partition of the Ottoman Balkans with the cynical efficiency that the age expected of him. Bulgaria was reduced in size but became autonomous, effectively independent. Serbia and Romania and Montenegro were recognized as fully independent states. Bosnia and Herzegovina were placed under Austrian occupation, the first step toward the annexation that would trigger the final crisis of the empire. And Britain, in exchange for its support of the Ottoman position, took Cyprus as a base from which to protect its interests in the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire, which had entered the war with hopes of defending its territory, lost nearly all of its European provinces in a single summer, and the remaining territories, Macedonia and Albania and Thrace, were clearly marked for future partition, their fate postponed only by the inability of the European powers to agree on who should have them. Abdul Hamid II, the Sultan who presided over the catastrophe of 1878, was Abdul Hamid II, who had ascended the throne in 1876, in the middle of the crisis, and who would reign for the next 33 years, the last great sultan of the Ottoman dynasty, the last to exercise real power, and became the most controversial figure in the whole long history of the empire's decline. Abdulhamid was, by any measure, a remarkable man. Intelligent, suspicious, diligent, utterly convinced that the empire was surrounded by enemies who meant to destroy it, foreign enemies in the European powers and internal enemies in the nationalist movements and the reformist intellectuals, and that the only way to survive was to concentrate power in his own hands, to play the European powers off against one another, and to appeal, above all, to the Islamic identity of the empire, the one source of loyalty that the Tanzimat reforms had neglected, and that might, Abdulhamid believed, hold the empire together when the nationalism of the subject peoples was tearing it apart. He suspended the constitution that had been proclaimed in 1876, the first Ottoman constitution, which the reformers had forced on his predecessor and which Abdulhamid had accepted as the price of his accession, and he dissolved the parliament that had been elected under it. And he ruled for the next 3 decades as an autocrat, governing from his palace of Yıldız, surrounded by a network of spies and informers who reported on the discontent of his subjects and the intrigues of his officials, a sultan who rarely left his palace and who saw enemies everywhere and who, by the sheer force of his fear, kept the empire together for a generation against forces that would have destroyed it sooner under a weaker man. Abdulhamid's reign is still debated by historians, and the debate will probably never be settled, because he was, simultaneously, a tyrant who crushed political dissent and presided over the massacres of his Armenian subjects, and a modernizer who built railways and telegraphs and schools and hospitals, who expanded the empire's infrastructure more than any sultan since the Golden Age, who understood that the empire could not survive without economic development, and who pursued it, in his own cautious, half-suspicious way, with considerable success. The railway that he built from Damascus to Medina, the Hejaz Railway, was one of the engineering marvels of its age, crossing hundreds of miles of desert to connect the holy cities of Islam to the imperial capital, and it was financed entirely by Muslim donations, without European loans, a demonstration that the empire could still accomplish great things with its own resources. The telegraph network that he extended across the length and breadth of the empire bound the provinces to the capital with a speed of communication that no previous sultan had commanded, and the schools that he established, secular and religious, educated a new generation of Ottomans who would, in the end, overthrow him. Because the students trained in Abdulhamid's schools absorbed the ideas of the age, nationalism and constitutionalism and the desire for freedom, and they turned those ideas against the regime that had educated them. The paradox of Abdulhamid, like the paradox of the Tanzimat, was that the institutions that were meant to save the empire also, in the long run, helped to destroy it by creating a new class of educated, ambitious men who could not be contained within the autocratic system that the Sultan had built. The Armenian question, which would become one of the defining tragedies of the empire's last decades, arose in its modern form during Abdulhamid's reign, and it is one of the most painful passages in this story, and it must be told honestly, because the Ottoman Empire, like every empire, had a gradient of suffering, and the Armenians, the ancient Christian people of eastern Anatolia, were near the bottom of the gradient, and their suffering, under Abdulhamid and then under his successors, would culminate in the great catastrophe of 1915, which we will come to in its proper place. The Armenian national awakening of the 19th century, the growth of Armenian political organizations demanding autonomy or independence, was one of the many nationalist movements that were tearing at the fabric of the Ottoman state, and the Sultan, who saw all such movements as threats to the empire's survival, responded with repression, and the repression, in the 1890s, escalated into massacres. The Hamidian massacres, in which tens of thousands of Armenians were killed by Ottoman troops and irregulars, a campaign of terror that horrified the European public and that earned Abdulhamid the title by which he is still remembered in the West: the Red Sultan, the Bloody Sultan, the murderer of his own subjects. The massacres did not solve the Armenian question. They deepened it, radicalizing the survivors and alienating the European powers whose support the empire still needed. And they established a pattern that would be repeated on a vastly larger scale in the violence of the First World War. The Young Turk Revolution, which broke out in 1908, began not in Istanbul but in the provinces, in the Ottoman Balkans, where the empire's remaining European territories were simmering with discontent, and where the army, the reformed army that Mahmud II had built and the Tanzimat had expanded, had become a seedbed of constitutionalist ideas. A group of young officers, educated in the new schools that Abdul Hamid had established, officers who had read the European political philosophers and who believed, with the passionate certainty of the young, that the empire could be saved only by the restoration of the constitution and the parliament, formed a secret society, the Committee of Union and Progress, and in the summer of 1908, they mutinied, or rather, they declared their rebellion and marched on the capital, and the Sultan, who had no reliable forces to oppose them, capitulated. The constitution was restored, the parliament was reconvened, and Abdul Hamid, who had ruled as an autocrat for 30 years, was reduced to a constitutional monarch, a figurehead, a symbol of the old order that the Young Turks intended to sweep away. The revolution was peaceful, almost bloodless, and it was greeted with an outpouring of popular enthusiasm that no one had expected. Muslims and Christians embracing in the streets, the old communal divisions apparently dissolved in a wave of Ottoman patriotism. The empire, which had seemed to be dying, suddenly alive with hope that the reform could succeed after all, that the Turkish and Arab and Greek and Armenian and Jewish subjects of the Sultan could come together as citizens of a common state, that the empire could be saved by liberty. It did not last. The counter-revolution came the following year, an uprising of conservative soldiers and religious students who wanted to restore the Sultan's authority and the primacy of Islam, and the Young Turks crushed it, deposed Abdul Hamid, and sent him into exile in Salonika, replacing him with his brother, Mehmed V, a mild, passive man who did what he was told, and who would reign through the catastrophe that was gathering on the horizon, and who would die, broken, a few months before the empire itself died. The Young Turks, having secured their power, began to implement their program, and the program was, in its essence, the program that the Tanzimat reformers had initiated and that Abdul Hamid had abandoned. The centralization and modernization of the state, the forging of an Ottoman national identity, the use of the state's power to transform society. But the Young Turks were less patient than the Tanzimat reformers had been, and more nationalist, and the tolerance that had characterized the early days of the revolution gave way, under the pressure of events, to an increasingly Turkish nationalism, a conviction that the empire's Muslim Turkish core was the only reliable foundation on which the state could be rebuilt, and that the Christian and non-Turkish subjects of the empire, who were demanding autonomy or independence or simply the right to be left alone, were obstacles to the empire's survival that would have to be dealt with, by force if necessary. The Balkan Wars. The testing of the Young Turk regime came almost at once, and the test was a disaster. In 1911, Italy, a newly unified European power seeking colonies to confirm its status, declared war on the Ottoman Empire and seized Libya, the last Ottoman province in North Africa, a war that the Ottoman Navy could not contest because the Navy had been neglected for decades and could not challenge the Italian fleet in the Mediterranean. The loss of Libya was humiliating but not fatal. The empire's real vulnerability was in the Balkans, where its remaining territories, Macedonia and Albania and Thrace, were claimed by the new Balkan states, Serbia and Greece and Bulgaria and Montenegro, which had been building their armies and nursing their grievances and waiting for the moment to strike. The moment came in 1912, when the Balkan states, putting aside their own rivalries long enough to form an alliance, declared war on the Ottoman Empire and their armies, smaller but better trained and better led and fighting on their own territory, swept through the Ottoman forces in a matter of weeks. The Ottoman army in the Balkans, which had been weakened by the purges of officers that the Young Turks had carried out after their revolution, collapsed, and the armies of the Balkan allies advanced to the gates of Istanbul. and the empire, which had ruled the Balkans for 5 centuries, lost almost all of its remaining European territory in a single campaign season. The peace treaty, signed in London in 1913, recognized the new borders, and then the Balkan allies, falling out over the spoils, fought a second war among themselves, in which the Ottomans managed to recover a small slice of territory around Edirne, the old Ottoman capital. But the recovery was a footnote. The Ottoman Empire in Europe had been reduced to a strip of land around Istanbul, a capital that was now vulnerable to any enemy who could force the straits. The catastrophe of the Balkan Wars radicalized the Young Turk regime, and the radicalization took a form that had been implicit in the movement from its beginning, but that had been held in check by the hope that the empire's diverse peoples could be reconciled. Turkish nationalism. The conviction that the empire's only hope of survival was to Turkify its remaining territories, to impose the Turkish language and Turkish culture and Turkish loyalty on the Arabs and the Armenians and the other peoples who still remained under Ottoman rule, and to eliminate those who could not be assimilated. The Committee of Union and Progress, which had been a broad coalition of reformers and constitutionalists, became, after 1913, the instrument of a triumvirate of ambitious, ruthless men. Enver Pasha, the young, dashing, vain war minister who had been one of the heroes of the 1908 revolution. Talat Pasha, the interior minister, a former telegraph clerk from Edirne, a man of immense organizational ability and chilling calm, who would become the principal architect of the Armenian genocide, and Cemal Pasha, the naval minister and governor of Syria, who would be remembered in the Arab memory as the tyrant who hanged Arab nationalists in the public squares of Beirut. The triumvirate, and Enver above all, were convinced that the empire's survival depended on a single, desperate gamble: alliance with Germany, the one European power that did not have territorial designs on Ottoman lands, the power that had been cultivating the Ottoman military for decades, sending instructors and building railways and establishing the personal connections that would, when the moment of decision came, prove decisive. The First World War. The moment came in the summer of 1914, the summer that Europe sleepwalked into the catastrophe that would destroy 4 empires and kill 10 million men and remake the map of the world. The Ottoman Empire was not, at the outset, a belligerent. The government was divided, and the Grand Vizier, the old and cautious Prince Said Halim Pasha, urged neutrality, and the Sultan, the passive, gentle Mehmed V, had no opinion and no influence, and did what he was told. But Enver Pasha, who was the real center of power in the regime, had made his decision, and the decision was for Germany, and the decision was made, in the end, in secret, in consultations with the German ambassador, and it was presented to the cabinet as a fait accompli. The Ottoman Navy, which had been reinforced by 2 German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, that had escaped the British Mediterranean fleet and taken refuge in the Straits, sailed into the Black Sea at the end of October and bombarded the Russian ports of Odessa and Sevastopol, and the Russian declaration of war followed within days. And by the end of the year, the Ottoman Empire was at war with Russia, Britain, and France, the 3 greatest powers on earth, in a war that it could not possibly win. The Ottoman military performance in the First World War was, against all expectations, considerably better than the empire's pre-war reputation would have led anyone to predict. The Ottoman army, reformed and re-equipped with German assistance, fought with a toughness and resilience that surprised the British and the Russians and the French, who had assumed that the sick man could not put up a serious fight. The defense of Gallipoli in 1915, the campaign that the British had designed to knock the Ottomans out of the war with a single stroke, was one of the great Ottoman victories of the entire war. The British and Anzac forces pinned on the beaches for months and finally evacuated with heavy losses, and the commander of the Ottoman defenses, a colonel named Mustafa Kemal, would emerge from the campaign with a reputation that would carry him, in time, to the presidency of the Republic that would replace the empire he had served. The campaign in Mesopotamia, where the British advanced toward Baghdad and were surrounded and forced to surrender at Kut in 1916. The largest surrender of British forces in more than a century was another Ottoman victory, though a temporary one, and the war on the Russian front in the Caucasus was a brutal frozen struggle in which both sides suffered appallingly and neither could achieve a decisive breakthrough. But the victories, such as they were tactical, not strategic, and the strategic situation of the empire was hopeless from the beginning. The Ottoman Empire, which had been bankrupt before the war, could not finance a modern industrial war. Its army, which fought bravely, was underfed and under-equipped and ravaged by disease, and the soldiers who died of typhus and dysentery and exposure far outnumbered those who died of wounds. The empire's infrastructure, the railways and the roads and the telegraphs that Abdul Hamid had built, was inadequate to the demands of total war, and the supplies that the army needed, the food and the ammunition and the medicine, could not be delivered to the fronts in sufficient quantities, and the soldiers went hungry and the wounded went untreated, and the civilian population, in the war zones and in the cities far from the fighting, went hungry too, because the empire could not feed itself, and the British blockade had cut off the imports on which the cities depended. The Ottoman Empire was not defeated by the enemy's armies, or not primarily. It was strangled slowly by the blockade, by the breakdown of its own infrastructure, by the demands of a war that exceeded its resources by an order of magnitude: the Armenian Genocide. And in the middle of the war, in the chaos and the desperation and the radicalizing logic of total conflict, the Ottoman government did the thing that has, more than any other single event, defined the empire's memory in the modern world, the thing that this story, if it is to be honest, cannot pass over, and that I, speaking to you in the quiet of the night, must find words for, inadequate as words are. The Armenian Genocide, the systematic destruction of the Armenian people of Anatolia, was not, as some of its apologists have claimed, a spontaneous outbreak of sectarian violence in the fog of war. It was a deliberate policy, planned and executed by the Ottoman government, specifically by the Committee of Union and Progress under the direction of Talat Pasha, and its aim was the elimination of the Armenian presence from the Ottoman heartland, the physical removal of a people who had lived in those lands for millennia. And the method was deportation, massacre, and starvation, carried out over the course of 1915 and 1916, in which something like 1 million Armenians, and perhaps more, were killed or died of hunger and exposure on the death marches into the Syrian desert. The details are as terrible as anything in the history of human cruelty, and I will not recite them here, because the recitation can become a kind of obscenity of its own. But they are recorded in the testimonies of survivors and the dispatches of American and German diplomats who witnessed what was happening and could not stop it, and they are part of the record, the ledger of the empire's last years, the cost that cannot be omitted from the accounting. The genocide did not, of course, save the empire. It was like the expulsions of 1492 and 1609 in the Spanish story, an act of self-mutilation, the destruction of a productive and loyal population that the empire, even in its reduced circumstances, could not afford to lose, and it left a wound in the memory of the Armenian people that has not healed and will not heal, and that continues, to this day, to trouble the relationship between Turkey and the world. The empire that committed the genocide was the empire of the Young Turks, not the empire of the Tanzimat reformers who had proclaimed the equality of all Ottoman subjects. And the descent from the hopes of 1908 to the horrors of 1915 is one of the most terrible chapters in the history of nationalism. The story of how a reform movement, born in idealism and the desire to save the state, became, under the pressure of war and territorial loss and ideological radicalization, the instrument of mass murder. The end. The war ended for the Ottomans in October 1918, a few weeks before it ended for the other Central Powers, and the armistice, signed on a British warship anchored off the island of Mudros, was a surrender in all but name. The Ottoman armies were to demobilize, the straits were to be open to the Allied fleets, the railways and the ports were to be placed under Allied control, and the Allies reserved the right to occupy any part of the empire that they considered necessary for their security. The British fleet steamed into the Bosphorus a few days later, and the Ottoman capital, which had not been occupied by a foreign army since 1453, came under the guns of the power that had now, beyond any question, replaced the empire as the dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean. Enver and Talat and Kemal, the triumvirate who had led the empire into the war, fled Istanbul on a German submarine, heading for exile and, in time, for assassination at the hands of Armenian avengers or their own internal rivals or the chaos of the post-war world. The Sultan, the gentle, passive Mehmed V, had died a few months before the armistice, and his brother, Mehmed VI, the last of the Ottoman sultans, ascended the throne of an empire that was already effectively dead, waiting only for the formalities to be completed. The formalities took 4 years. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, was the death warrant of the Ottoman Empire, and it was, even by the standards of the peace treaties that the victorious powers imposed on the defeated at the end of the First World War, a draconian document. The empire was dismembered. The Arab provinces, Iraq and Palestine and Syria and the Hejaz, were stripped away and divided between the British and the French as mandates, territories that were not quite colonies, but that would be governed by the European powers until they were ready for independence, a readiness that the European powers, in many cases, judged to be indefinitely delayed. The Straits were internationalized, the Ottoman army was limited to a token force, the finances of the state were placed under Allied control, and Anatolia itself, the Turkish heartland, was partitioned into zones of influence for the European powers, with the Greeks, who had entered the war on the Allied side, promised the city of Izmir and a large swath of the Aegean coast, a reward for their loyalty that would, within a few years, prove to be a catastrophe for the Greeks themselves. The empire that had once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Indian Ocean was reduced, on the map attached to the treaty, to a rump state in the interior of Anatolia, a territory so small and so constrained that it could not possibly survive as an independent power, and the Sultan's government, which had been reduced to a puppet regime under British protection, signed the treaty because it had no alternative, because the army had been disbanded and the treasury was empty and the capital was occupied, because the empire, after 600 years, had reached the end of its long road. But the treaty was never implemented. The man who had won the Battle of Gallipoli, Mustafa Kemal, the officer whom the Sultan had sent to Anatolia to oversee the demobilization of the remaining Ottoman forces, had instead begun to organize resistance, assembling a national movement in the interior, a movement that rejected the Treaty of Sèvres and the Sultan's authority and the presence of foreign armies on Turkish soil. The Turkish War of Independence, which lasted from 1919 to 1922, was fought against the Greeks and the Armenians and the French, and indirectly, against the British. And it was fought by an army that was, by any rational calculation, too small and too poorly equipped to defeat the forces arrayed against it. And it won, because the Greeks had overextended themselves, and the French had lost the will to fight, and the British public, exhausted by 4 years of war, had no appetite for another campaign in the Near East, and because Mustafa Kemal, who would one day be called Ataturk, the father of the Turks, was a commander of genius and a politician of ruthless clarity, and a man who understood, as the Sultans and the young Turks had not understood, that the age of empire was over and that the future belonged to the nation-state. The victory of the nationalist forces made the Treaty of Sèvres a dead letter, and a new treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, was negotiated in 1923, and it recognized the Republic of Turkey as the sovereign state of the Turkish people, with borders that were roughly the borders of modern Turkey, and it abrogated the capitulations and the other restrictions that the old empire had labored under, and it marked the formal end of the Ottoman state, which had already, in practice, ceased to exist. The Sultanate was abolished in November 1922, and Mehmed VI, the last Sultan, the 36th in the line of Osman, was smuggled out of Istanbul on a British warship, taking with him his personal effects and his dignity and nothing else, and he died in exile in San Remo a few years later, the last of his line to claim the title of sultan, and the caliphate, which the Ottomans had held for 4 centuries, was abolished in 1924, and the last Ottoman prince, the last man who might have claimed the succession, left Istanbul a few months later, and the Empire of Osman, which had begun as a dream of a tree whose branches covered the world, was, after 600 years, extinguished. The long reverberation. Empires, when they fall, do not simply vanish from the earth. They leave their traces in the peoples they ruled and the borders they drew and the habits of mind they inculcated, and the traces of the Ottoman Empire are everywhere, in the Balkans and the Middle East and North Africa, in the institutions of the modern Turkish state, in the memory of the peoples who lived for centuries under the Sultan's rule, and who still, in ways they do not always acknowledge, carry the empire inside them. The Ottoman legacy is not a single thing. It is contested and contradictory, and differently remembered by the different peoples who experienced it, and it is worth walking through in the last hour of the night to understand what the empire left behind and what it still means in the world we inhabit, that the empire was, for 600 years, the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Islamic world. The simplest, most visible legacy is the map, because the modern states of the Middle East and the Balkans, the countries whose names fill the headlines of our own age, Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Palestine and Jordan and Israel, were shaped, in their origins, by the Ottoman administration and its dissolution. The borders that the British and French drew when they partitioned the Arab provinces after the First World War were arbitrary, as borders drawn by colonial powers always are, but they were drawn on a palimpsest, and the underlying text was Ottoman. The provinces of Baghdad and Aleppo and Damascus and Beirut, which had been Ottoman administrative units for centuries, provided the rough outlines of the new states, and the officials who staffed the new governments were, in many cases, the same officials who had served the Sultan, men trained in Ottoman schools and Ottoman methods, who carried the habits of Ottoman governance into the post-Ottoman world. The monarchies that the British established in Iraq and Jordan and the French attempted to establish in Syria were variations on the Ottoman theme, attempts to create the stable, centralized states that the Ottoman reformers had dreamed of. And their failures, the coups and the revolutions and the civil wars that have plagued the Middle East for a century, are, in part, the legacy of the Ottoman failure to forge a common identity among the diverse peoples of the region before the empire collapsed. The religious legacy is equally profound and equally contested. The Ottoman Empire was, at its height, the preeminent Sunni Muslim power in the world, the seat of the caliphate, the protector of the holy cities, the patron of Islamic law and scholarship, and its claim to leadership of the Sunni world was one of the foundations of its legitimacy. When the empire fell and the caliphate was abolished, the Sunni world lost the institutional center that had ordered its religious life for centuries, and the search for a new center, a new source of religious authority, has been one of the great themes of modern Islamic history. The search that gave rise, in part, to the movements of Islamic revival and reform that have shaped our own age. From the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to the Saudi state that arose from the alliance of the House of Saud with the Wahhabi movement, a movement that the Ottomans had seen as a heretical threat and had suppressed with considerable violence in the early 19th century. The Turkish Republic, which succeeded the empire, was, under Ataturk, aggressively secular, abolishing the caliphate and closing the religious courts and the religious schools, and removing Islam from the constitution and the tension between the secular state and the religious population. The legacy of the empire's Islamic identity, in a republic that defined itself against that identity, has been the central fault line of Turkish politics for nearly a century. The fault line that the current Turkish government, under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has attempted to bridge by restoring Islam to the public sphere while maintaining the trappings of the secular state, a balancing act that would have been familiar to many an Ottoman sultan. The ethnic legacy, the legacy that is most visible and most painful in our own time, is the patchwork of peoples that the empire governed and that the nation-states that succeeded it have struggled, often violently, to homogenize. The Ottoman Empire was, for most of its history, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state in which Turks and Arabs and Kurds and Greeks and Armenians and Albanians and Bosnians and Jews and dozens of smaller communities lived under the same sovereign and the same law. And the empire managed this diversity for centuries with a tolerance that was, by the standards of the age, remarkable. The millet system granting each religious community a degree of autonomy over its own internal affairs and the imperial administration, staffed by the diverse peoples of the empire, providing a common framework that bound the communities together. The tolerance was not, of course, the tolerance of modern liberalism. It was the tolerance of a dominant religion that permitted subordinate religions to exist on condition of their subordination, and the hierarchy was enforced, and the equality that the Tanzimat reformers proclaimed was never fully realized. And the violence of the last decades, the massacres and the expulsions and the genocide, demonstrated with terrible clarity the fragility of the old arrangement when the empire came under the pressure of nationalism and war. The nation-states that emerged from the empire's ruins, Turkey and Greece and Bulgaria and the others, built their national identities by expelling or assimilating the minorities that did not fit. The population exchanges that followed the Balkan Wars and the Greco-Turkish War, the expulsion of the Greeks from Anatolia and the Turks from Greece, the assimilation of the Albanians and the Bosnians into the new Slavic states of Yugoslavia, the long, unfinished struggle of the Kurds, who were promised a state in the Treaty of Sèvres and who were denied it in the Treaty of Lausanne, and who remain, today, a people divided among 4 countries, still seeking the self-determination that the 20th century settlement denied them. The Ottoman Empire, for all its faults, had provided a home for diversity. The nation-states that replaced it have, in many cases, been unable to do the same, and the sectarian and ethnic violence that plagues the Middle East today is, in no small part, the consequence of the failure to build stable multi-ethnic states on the ruins of the Ottoman multi-ethnic empire. The Turkish Republic. The state that emerged from the ruins of the empire, the Republic of Turkey, was, in its founding ideology, a repudiation of everything the Ottoman Empire had stood for, and it is one of the strangest facts of this entire story that the man who had saved the Turkish nation from partition, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, was determined to sever that nation from its Ottoman past so completely that the past became, in the official ideology of the new state, a kind of shame, a period of decadence and decline and Oriental superstition that the Turks had to overcome if they were to take their place among the modern nations of the world. Ataturk's reforms were the most radical program of modernization that any Muslim society had ever attempted, and they were imposed from above with a speed and a ruthlessness that the Ottoman reformers could only have dreamed of. The Sultanate and the Caliphate abolished, the religious schools and courts closed, the Arabic script replaced with the Latin alphabet, the veil discouraged, and the fez outlawed, women given civil and political rights that no Islamic state had ever granted. The entire apparatus of the old order dismantled and a new secular, nationalist, westernizing order erected in its place. The transformation was breathtaking, and it succeeded, to a degree that historians are still measuring, and the Turkey that emerged from the Ataturk period was a country that was, in its institutions and its self-understanding, a modern nation-state rather than an empire, a country that looked to Europe rather than to the Islamic world, a country that had, in its own official memory, buried the Ottomans. But the burial was never complete, and the Ottoman past has returned, in recent decades, to the center of Turkish political consciousness, because the past that is denied does not simply vanish. It waits, and it returns. And the return of the Ottoman memory in contemporary Turkey, the nostalgia for the imperial glory and the Islamic civilization and the multi-ethnic tolerance that the old empire supposedly represented, is one of the most striking developments in the recent history of the Middle East. The Turkish government of the last 2 decades, under the Justice and Development Party of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has explicitly invoked the Ottoman legacy as a model for Turkey's role in the world. A neo-Ottoman foreign policy that seeks to restore Turkish influence in the former Ottoman territories, the Balkans and the Middle East and North Africa, and a domestic politics that seeks to reconcile the secular institutions of the Republic with the Islamic identity that the Republic attempted to suppress. The restoration is contested, as everything in Turkey is contested, between the Islamists who see the Ottoman period as a golden age of Muslim power and the secularists who see it as a period of backwardness that Ataturk rightly ended, between the Turks who want their country to look westward and those who want it to look eastward and southward, to the Arab world and the Islamic world and the lands that were once Ottoman, and that, in some sense that is more emotional than political, still are. The Ottoman Empire, 600 years after Osman dreamed his dream, and a century after the last sultan walked into exile, is still present in the Turkish imagination. A memory that will not fade, a past that will not pass. The lessons of the long duration. And so we come to the end of this long night story, and perhaps it is only fitting to spend the last of our time together before the dawn comes, trying to understand what the story means, what it teaches, what we can carry away from it into our own lives and our own age. The Ottoman Empire lasted 600 years, one of the longest-lasting dynasties in the history of the world, and it rose from nothing, from a tent in the hills of western Anatolia, to rule 3 continents and dozens of peoples, and to claim, with considerable justice, to be the legitimate successor of Rome and the rightful sovereign of the world of Islam. It was, at its height, the most powerful state in Europe, the terror of Christendom, the patron of a civilization that produced architecture and poetry and law and administration of the highest quality, the model of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that held its diverse peoples together for centuries by a combination of tolerance and coercion and administrative efficiency and sheer accumulated habit. And it fell slowly, gradually, over 2.5 centuries, by a process that was never dramatic enough to force the kind of reckoning that might have saved it. The institutions decaying, the economy stagnating, the military falling behind, the political system paralyzed by the weakness of the sultans and the vested interests of the old order, until the empire was the sick man, the hollow shell, the thing that the European powers kept alive, because they could not agree on how to divide it. And then the First World War came, and the shell cracked, and the empire was gone. What does this story teach us? It teaches, first, the thing that all the stories on this channel teach, which is that empires are mortal, that even the mightiest and the longest-lasting of them contain within themselves the seeds of their own decay, that the institutions that build greatness can become, over time, the institutions that prevent renewal, that the flexibility and openness that characterize empires at their height can harden into rigidity and defensiveness, that the very success of an imperial system creates the vested interests that block the reforms necessary to sustain it. The Ottoman Empire, at its peak, was one of the most adaptable and innovative states in the world, absorbing the best of every civilization it encountered and turning it to Ottoman purposes. By its end, it had become one of the most conservative and self-isolated, unable to learn from the Europeans who had learned from the Ottomans, unable to change, unable even to see itself clearly. The pattern is not unique to the Ottomans. We have heard it in the story of the Spanish Empire, and we will hear it again in the stories of other empires, the rhythm of rise and peak and long decline, the afternoon that feels like noon to the people living through it, the inability to recognize that the sun has begun to set. It teaches, second, the complexity of historical judgment, the difficulty of evaluating an institution as vast and as long-lasting as the Ottoman Empire, according to the moral categories of our own time. The empire was, by modern standards, a despotism, an autocracy in which the sultan's will was law, and in which the institutions of representative government, the parliaments and the free press and the independent judiciary, were absent or weak or late in coming. It practiced slavery in the form of the devshirme and the imperial harem. It was capable of great cruelty, the fratricide of the princes and the massacres of the Armenians and the routine violence of a pre-modern state against its own subjects. And it was also, by the standards of its age, remarkably tolerant, providing a home for religious diversity when most of Europe was persecuting its minorities, and its administration was remarkably efficient, and its law was remarkably just, and its subjects, for most of its history, were better governed and more secure than the subjects of most contemporary states. The Ottoman Empire, like every empire, was a mixture of good and evil, of achievement and oppression, of genuine civilization and genuine brutality, and the mixture cannot be separated into its components. It can only be observed with the honesty that history demands, and the judgment, if judgment must be made, should be made with humility, with the recognition that our own age, like every age, will be judged by posterity for crimes that we do not yet recognize as crimes. And it teaches, finally, the thing that I find myself returning to, at the end of this long night, and that I will leave beside you as the lights go out. The human scale of the story. The fact that the empire was not an abstraction but an arrangement of human lives, millions upon millions of them, stretched across 6 centuries and 3 continents. The peasants in the Balkan villages who paid their taxes and lived their lives and never saw the sultan or the capital. The Christian boys taken in the devshirme who rose to command armies and build mosques and govern provinces. The women of the harem who exercised power from behind the screens. The merchants in the covered bazaars of Aleppo and Cairo and Istanbul who traded across the length and breadth of the empire. The poets and the architects and the calligraphers who made the civilization that the empire supported. The soldiers who died on the frontiers from Hungary to the Caucasus. The reformers who tried to save the empire and were killed by the forces they were trying to reform. The last sultan walking into exile with his dignity and his personal effects and the weight of 6 centuries on his shoulders. The Ottoman Empire was not a system or a structure or a phase of history. It was the lives of all those people, lived one at a time, day by day, year by year, and the memory of those lives, however dim, however fragmented, is what remains when the systems and the structures and the phases are gone. The mosque and the republic. I want to leave you with a single image because stories like this one need images to hold on to. In the quiet after the voice stops. In the city of Istanbul, on a hill overlooking the Golden Horn, the Mosque of Suleymaniye still stands, the masterpiece of Sinan, the dome that he built 4.5 centuries ago as the ultimate expression of Ottoman civilization at its height. The mosque is still in use. The call to prayer still sounds from its minarets. The faithful still gather in its courtyard and prostrate themselves in its sanctuary. And in the crypt beneath the mosque, in a small octagonal chamber, the tomb of Suleyman the Magnificent still holds the remains of the greatest of the Ottoman sultans, the lawgiver, the conqueror, the husband of Hürrem, the executioner of his own sons. And a few miles away, across the water, in the mausoleum that the Turkish Republic built for its founder, the body of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk lies in state, the man who destroyed the empire that Suleiman ruled and built the nation that replaced it. The mosque and the mausoleum stand on the same soil, under the same sky, in the same city that was Constantinople and is Istanbul, the city that has been a capital of empires for 16 centuries, the city where the Ottoman story began and ended. And the 2 monuments, the Sultan's tomb and the President's mausoleum, are a single landscape, the landscape of memory that the Turks and the peoples of the former Ottoman world still inhabit, whether they acknowledge it or not. The empire is gone, but the city remains, and the people remain, and the memory of what the empire was remains, and the question of what the memory means, what it should mean, what it demands of those who carry it, is still open, and will be open for a long time yet. If you are still awake out there, thank you for keeping me company through the whole long journey, through the dream of Osman and the ships over the hill, through the golden age and the long afternoon, through the reformers and the revolutions, Through the genocide and the war and the quiet morning when the last sultan packed his bags and walked out of the palace and into history. There is a kind of peace, I think, in stories like this one. The peace of watching even the mightiest things of this world, its sultanates and its armies and its certainties, soften slowly into memory, into telling, into a voice in a dark room. Whatever is pressing on you tonight, it too is smaller than an empire, and it too will pass through its noon and its afternoon and its dusk, and become, one day, only a story. Another story will be waiting on the screen whenever you are ready for it, and it will keep until morning. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to like and subscribe, or to leave a thought down in the comments below, and perhaps your location and your local time, so that some other sleepless soul, somewhere far away, might know they are not the only one awake beneath the dark. But for now, there is nothing left to conquer, and nowhere left to march. Close your eyes and let yourself drift off to sleep. Good night, and sweet dreams.